One day, my mother-in-law dropped a bombshell on me. She said that my husband was having an affair and that she was supporting him in this. On top of that, they planned to live together at the mistress's house. At my in-laws' home, my father-in-law was in a wheelchair and needed constant care. Despite this, my husband and his mother both left to live with the mistress. What they did was clearly unforgivable. Still, I couldn't just abandon my father-in-law, so I stayed to take care of him. As I struggled with what to do, my father-in-law suddenly stood up. My name is Linda, and I'm 30 years old. I've been married to my husband, Bob, for almost 3 years. In the beginning, our relationship was great, but now we don't talk as much. Is this what people mean by getting used to each other? The more we knew about each other, the more our love settled down, and we started living a more stable life. There was nothing wrong with our marriage, but it had become a bit boring. About a year ago, Bob's job got busier. He started working overtime and going on business trips, which used to be rare. He still took care of all the bills, and I had my own job too, so I couldn't always be worried about him. Sometimes, when he came home early, we'd have dinner together and catch up. It might seem from the outside like our marriage was cooling off, but that wasn't true. This was just how our life was. Then one day, I came home from work and found Bob there already. Normally, he wouldn't be home until after 10 p.m., but it was only 7 p.m. "Welcome back," I said. "You're home early, didn't you have to work overtime?" He responded, "That's not the point. My father had an accident and is in the hospital." According to my husband, his father had an accident while heading to work at his own company. A car ran a red light and crashed into him. Luckily, his injuries weren't fatal, but he ended up paralyzed in both legs and one arm, leaving him in a wheelchair. I couldn't believe it. My father-in-law, who loved hiking and fishing, was now stuck in a wheelchair. It was heartbreaking. He was always an outdoor person and would take my husband and me on trips to various places. He treated me like his own daughter and often said, "If you ever have any problems, don't hesitate to ask me for help." Now, hearing that he had an accident was hard to accept. My father-in-law owned his own company, but since my husband worked elsewhere, we weren't told right away about the accident. We only found out when my mother-in-law called us. In these times, it was difficult to visit him as often as we wanted, and it was frustrating. One day, my husband, Bob, spoke to me with a serious look on his face. "Linda, Mom asked me for help with Dad." "What does she need?" I asked. "She's finding it hard to take care of him by herself, so she's wondering if we could help." "You mean take care of your father?" I asked. "Yeah," Bob said. "Mom's getting older, and she can't manage everything alone anymore." "So we'd have to move to your parents' house?" "Yes, there's plenty of space there, and we could all live comfortably. What do you think?" I fell silent. I cared deeply for my father-in-law, but I couldn't just agree to something I'd never done before without thinking it through. "It's not that I don't care about your father," I said, "but I also have my job." Suddenly being asked to provide care, I'm not sure what to do. I tried to think of the best solution, but nothing came to mind. Sensing my hesitation, Bob took my hand and looked at me directly. "I need you," Bob said. "I know it's going to be tough since it's your first time, but I'm worried that if we leave everything to Mom, she'll break down too." "I think it will be hard," I said, "but I have my job." "You can quit your job, Linda. I'll cover all the expenses. Can you focus on taking care of Mom and Dad?" "Quit my job?" "Yes," Bob said. "I'll support us financially. That's why I need you. Our family needs you." He was practically begging me on his knees. Eventually, I decided to quit my job and take care of my father-in-law, just as Bob had asked. A few days after we moved in with Bob's parents, he suddenly announced, "I'm going to take over my father's company and become the president." Even my father-in-law was surprised, but he seemed happy that his son was willing to take over the business. With tears in his eyes, my father-in-law said, "Bob, I can't believe you're saying this after all the times you said you didn't want to work for the company." "Well, with you in this condition, Dad, I can't just let the company go. I need to step up." "Thank you," his father said. "I was worried about what would happen to the company. I thought I'd have to leave it to someone I trusted, but if you're willing to take it over, I'd like to pass it on to you." "I'll do my best, Dad. I'm counting on you. Please make sure the employees have a good working environment." "Of course," Bob said. Bob officially took over the company, and my father-in-law stepped down from president to chairman. Although the chairman usually has responsibilities, my father-in-law decided to let Bob run the company completely, keeping only the title. 2 months passed since Bob became president. Every day, He would come home late, usually past midnight. At first, I thought he was just busy with his new role and was working overtime, but working late every single night seemed strange. What really made me suspicious was the odd smell coming from him. One night, I couldn't sleep, so I got up to get a glass of water from the kitchen. I heard the front door open, and when I greeted Bob with, "Welcome home," I noticed a strong smell of soap coming from him. Bob looked surprised to see me awake. "What? Why are you up at this hour?" "I couldn't sleep. You've been coming home late a lot," I said. "Well, I can't help it. I've taken over Dad's company, and there's a lot I don't know." "I see, you must be exhausted," I replied. "I'm tired, I'm going to bed," he said, trying to leave, but again, I caught that strong soap scent. On impulse, I grabbed his arm and asked firmly, "Bob, who do you usually work overtime with?" "What? Why are you asking me that?" he responded defensively. "I just noticed a nice scent on you." "How should I know? I'm working hard, so stop asking me petty questions." His irritated expression only made my suspicions grow. As I wondered how to confront him, Bob let out a frustrated sigh. "Can you stop with that already?" Bob snapped. "I come home tired, and you start questioning me right away. That's not a nice welcome." "I didn't mean to, I was just curious," I explained. "So you're doubting me? We're living comfortably because I work like this every day. Do you understand that?" "I do, and I appreciate it." "Then cut it out. If you have time to talk about this, why don't you do some cleaning instead?" "I don't have time for this." With that, he stormed upstairs, leaving me alone. Later, when I peeked into the bedroom, he was ignoring me, playing on his phone. I tried to apologize, but he completely ignored me. The next day, my mother-in-law confronted me with an angry expression. "Linda, I heard you suspected Bob of cheating yesterday." "I didn't suspect him," I said. "I just asked who he was working overtime with." "That's suspicious enough," she shouted. "You're only able to live because Bob works hard. Do you realize that?" "I do, and I'm grateful. I was just voicing a concern I had." "Well, it was rude. What are you trying to do, make Bob uncomfortable? You're the worst wife ever." After yelling at me, she dumped all the housework on me and stormed off. My mother-in-law has never really liked me. In front of my husband and father-in-law, she pretends to help with housework, but I'm the one who does all the chores. I also take care of my father-in-law. My mother-in-law often finds excuses to go out and only comes home in the evening. My father-in-law, who mostly stays in his room, doesn't know how often she leaves during the day. Occasionally, people from the company visit him, but other than that, he rarely leaves his room. On top of that, my mother-in-law warned me not to tell my father-in-law or Bob about anything unnecessary. So, I had no choice but to quietly do all the housework and caregiving. What made it bearable was my father-in-law's kindness. Every time I helped him, he would thank me with a sorry expression. "Linda, I'm so sorry. You must hate taking care of an old man like me, right?" "That's not true at all," I reassured him. "I think of you as my own father," I told my father-in-law. "It's an honor to help you." "Having you say that makes me feel lucky," he replied. "I'm really glad someone like you married Bob." "Likewise," I said. "I'm glad to have a kind person like you as my father-in-law." In the midst of the hurtful words and actions from my husband and mother-in-law, my father-in-law, who needed me, was the one keeping me going. Every night, I would help him get ready for bed, wipe him down, and turn off the lights. But today, as I returned to the living room, I was surprised to see Bob and my mother-in-law there. My husband had a strange grin on his face, and I had a bad feeling about it. Then, my mother-in-law said, "Good timing, I have something to tell you. I'll get straight to the point. You should take care of your father here for the rest of your life." "Wait, what?" I asked, shocked. "I've decided to live with a new daughter-in-law," she continued. "Bob will be with me too." "A new daughter-in-law?" I was speechless. As if to mock me, my husband threw divorce papers in front of me. "I have a girlfriend," he said. "My mom and I are moving in with her. Whether you submit the divorce papers is up to you, but you'll still be responsible for taking care of Dad." I felt like the world was crumbling around me and collapsed to my knees. Bob and my mother-in-law started packing their things, leaving me alone in the silent living room. Tears started falling when, suddenly, my father-in-law appeared in his wheelchair. "Linda, what's all this noise? Where's Bob and his mother?" he asked. "And why are you crying?" I explained everything that had happened, and his expression grew serious. By the time I finished, his eyes had a determined look. He stood up quickly, shocking me. "Linda, It's time for a counterattack, he said. Huh? Your legs? I stammered. Sorry for keeping it a secret, but I've been able to walk for a while now. Leave everything to me. The preparations are already in place. My father-in-law pulled a large brown envelope from a drawer and showed me its contents. Inside were documents proving my husband's affair and, to my surprise, evidence of my mother-in-law's affair as well. He explained that after Bob became president, he had trusted employees keep an eye on him. They discovered that Bob left work on time every day, even though he always came home after midnight. My father-in-law hired a private detective to investigate further. He also suspected his wife, who frequently went out during the day, and had her investigated too. Both of their affairs came to light, and he had just recently gathered the evidence. He had been waiting for the right moment to tell me the truth. I'm glad we could talk, Linda, my father-in-law said. What do you want to do? I want to get back at them, I replied. Leave the rest to me, he said, and made a call to someone from his company. Soon after, my husband was demoted from his CEO position. I filed for divorce, as my father-in-law had suggested, using the evidence of the affair, through a lawyer. I also asked for compensation from Bob and his lover. A week later, Bob came to the house, likely because he had received a legal notice. In front of me and my father-in-law, he shouted angrily, Dad, what's going on? Just because I cheated, you're firing me as CEO? Shut up, my father-in-law responded. You didn't help with my care, and you hurt Linda. You're not fit to lead the company. But, Bob fell to his knees in tears, clinging to me. Linda, please, I don't mind if you retract the divorce. Convince Dad to let me stay. I'll break up with my lover. Please drop the compensation claim. Even then, Bob was only thinking about himself. I was completely done with him. I let out all my frustration. What are you talking about? Retract the divorce? No way. I'm thrilled to be free of a scumbag like you. The divorce is final, and everything that's happened is your fault. But I thought you were only using the divorce as a threat, Bob pleaded. I wasn't. I hope you, your mom, and your lover all go to hell. You need to stop expecting help from anyone. I threw him out the front door. From outside, I could hear him pleading. Help me, I was wrong. I won't cheat again. Please forgive me. Linda, Dad, please don't abandon me. Neither my father-in-law nor I responded to his cries. Later, Bob and my mother-in-law were sued for alimony. They broke up with the mistress and were kicked out of her home. Becoming homeless, they ended up living in a comic book cafe and working low-paying jobs. Their savings were drained, and they accumulated debt, leaving them in poverty. On the other hand, I continued to take care of my father-in-law. Despite the divorce, he kindly said, You're welcome to stay as long as you'd like. Grateful for his kindness, I decided to continue living with him. Recently, my father-in-law has started going to a daycare service during the day, which allowed me to start working again during those hours. There will be challenges ahead, but I'm determined to do my best and continue caring for my father-in-law.
Michelle sat in the kitchen as the pre-dawn twilight mingled with the warm light from the night lamp. She waited for a truck to transport her belongings from the apartment she had rented for nearly 8 years. Michelle arrived at this apartment as a naive and inexperienced young woman fresh out of school and just starting college. Back then she felt like a child, and now Michelle was a different person, an adult, knowledgeable about life, carrying the weight of experience. She was even a bit envious of her younger, more enthusiastic self, who believed the best and most exciting experiences were still to come. Initially, it was like that. Life in the city swept Michelle into a whirlwind of studies, new acquaintances, and unfamiliar entertainment. It was fun. Then a series of troubles fell on her, forcing her to grow up quickly, shed her rose-tinted glasses and fight. Michelle was born and raised in the village, over 100 kilometers away from the bustling city. Her parents had been childless for many years and had tried everything. They travelled to holy sites, visited healing springs, and sought help from various herbalists. This was after official medicine declared Michelle's mother infertile. Doctors didn't give her any chance of becoming pregnant and advised her to either accept the situation or adopt a child. Only then did the couple decide to explore unconventional methods. Eventually, a miracle occurred. However, by the time Michelle was born, her parents were already over 40. While their peers were becoming grandparents, they were just starting to raise a child. The girls' childhood was idyllic, loving parents, a crowd of friends and a loyal dog. Summers were filled with bike rides to the river and walks in the forest. In winter, the same group of friends enjoyed sledding down hills and building massive snow fortresses. Michelle's parents doted on her, finding delight and amazement in all she did. She grew up feeling secure, enveloped in love and acceptance. As she grew older, Michelle did notice that her friends' parents were younger and more physically fit, but this never bothered her. In fact, she used to feel sorry for her peers when she saw how their parents treated them, shouting, showing irritation, and sometimes even resorting to physical punishment. Michelle's family was different. Her parents respected her wishes and were very attentive. Home was a place of unwavering support for Michelle. "Study to become a white-collar," her mother advised. "You'll work in a comfortable office, unlike me, who used to work on the farm from dawn to dusk. Physical labour quickly wears out a woman's beauty." "Listen to your mother," the father chimed in. "You're smart, you can handle anything." The father and mother often set their neighbour's son Brian as an example for Michelle. The boy was short, sturdy and had a pleasant disposition, though he was not conventionally handsome, like the most handsome boy from their school. Brian was different from the other village children. Instead of playing soccer, he spent his time reading books from the local library. Michelle found it strange that Brian preferred anatomy books and treatises on the human body over adventure novels or comic books. She had trouble understanding the titles of these textbooks, let alone their content. But nobody was surprised when Brian, after finishing school, entered the medical academy in the capital. Brian's parents were proud to share their son's success with the neighbours. Being a student, he already assisted a famous surgeon and was working on an important and complicated research project. Michelle felt both happiness and sadness. Brian had soared so high that she couldn't reach him. The truth was that she was always fond of him, but she never confessed her feelings. First of all, she was, for him, just a little girl. And secondly, she didn't want to hang herself on the guy's neck. Michelle wasn't like that. What attracted Michelle to Brian? His kind, intelligent eyes, his calm demeanour, and his inner strength and confidence. Brian always seemed to know what to do in any situation. And he was different from the other boys. He paid little attention to girls, focusing solely on his academics. Occasionally, he and Michelle would chat. Living nearby, they often returned from school or the store together, discussing everything from the weather and village events to broader topics like world issues and ecology. Michelle didn't have such interesting conversations with anyone else. She always wished she could chat with Brian a bit longer at the gate, but he was always rushing to get back to his books. Of course, Brian was not only popular with Michelle, the other girls were also attracted to him. They behaved more boldly and freely than the modest Michelle, but their attempts to get Brian's attention were futile too. Michelle rejoiced quietly at their failures and took pleasure in their disappointment. When Brian entered the capital's academy and left the village, Michelle realized that she would never see him again. Their friendly chats and engaging conversations had ended, and it was a sad reality, which was out of her hands. Years passed, and Michelle finally graduated too. The joy of receiving her diploma was marred by her father's hospitalization due to a heart attack the day before. As teachers spoke warmly about Michelle at the graduation ceremony, her father was battling for his life in intensive care. Michelle and her mother, worried about their loved one, could hardly enjoy the festivities. Of course, Michelle had envisioned this day differently. She had worked tirelessly, studying hard to make her parents proud at her graduation. For the first time, she regretted that her parents were quite old. Previously, she had appreciated their advanced age, as they were more tolerant towards her than younger parents might be. However, her father's situation served as a stark reminder that older parents may have health problems, and something bad could happen at any moment. Her father had spent all of June and half of July in a coma. He was not aware that his daughter had been accepted into college. In midsummer, he passed away in the hospital without regaining consciousness. His passing was a significant blow to both Michelle and her mother. But life went on, and soon after the funeral, the girl and her mother selected an apartment in the city where Michelle would reside during her studies. It was a tiny apartment in an old 5-story building, conveniently located nearby of the college. Michelle was excited to start this new chapter in her life. It was both exciting and interesting, and it also helped her cope with the loss of her father. The new experiences were a needed distraction. Settling into city life, Michelle began to regain the zest for life. She made new friends and even started dating a fellow student named Larry. They enjoyed each other's company, going to cafes and taking walks along the embankment. Their relationship was light and superficial, and they both understood this. Neither of them harboured strong feelings for the other, but they were content with their arrangement. It was common to date casually, and they were satisfied with their easygoing relationship. Michelle and Darcy became friends during their studies. Although they studied in different departments, they shared some lectures. They first met when Darcy forgot her fountain pen, and Michelle lent her a spare. Darcy lived with her overbearing parents in the city, and often stayed overnight at Michelle's place to escape their control. "I envy you. You live alone. No one gets on your nerves," Darcy would often sigh. In response, Michelle would simply shake her head. She didn't argue with Darcy, knowing she wouldn't understand. Michelle envied Darcy too, for she had both her parents. To Michelle, Darcy's parents were not evil. They simply loved their daughter and cared about her future. The bitterness of her father's loss often came back to her, sometimes quite painfully. Besides, her mother also caused anxiety. She frequently had headaches and high blood pressure. Despite her mother's attempts to hide all this, Michelle could see through their video calls that she was unwell. In the end, in her 3rd year, Michelle suffered another loss. Her mother passed away from a stroke. The incident occurred in front of their neighbour, who called an ambulance, but it was too late. The neighbours in the village helped organise the funeral and memorial services. Michelle was immensely grateful for their support. But her new friends, Larry and Darcy, were not as supportive. Larry evaporated, unable to withstand the devastation that the tragedy had caused in Michelle. Darcy tried to distract Michelle, but her words and actions were so ineffective that they only made Michelle feel worse. Eventually, Darcy too left Michelle, although not permanently. "It's probably best for you to be alone right now. Well, you can call me if you need anything when you come to your senses." It was a challenging period. Michelle had to rebuild herself and rise from the ashes. Adapting to total loneliness was not easy. For a long time, she yearned to call her mother to share news or discuss problems. However, gradually, Michelle returned to normal life. With graduation looming, Michelle's acquaintances, including Darcy, were making various plans for their post-graduation lives. Some dreamed of travelling, others considered further studies. But Michelle had only one option: to find a job. Adulthood and responsibility were daunting, but she had to survive. Despite her qualifications, Michelle couldn't find a job in her field. Who would hire a lawyer with no experience? Her 22-year-old age and gender worked against her. "You're young, you'll get married, then go on maternity leave, then perhaps a second one, followed by an endless cycle of sick leaves. We know your type," a human resources manager said to her once. While other employees weren't as outspoken, Michelle could read their reluctance in their expressions. No one wanted to hire, train, and then pay maternity and sick leave for a young, inexperienced girl. Despite her assurances that she didn't plan to marry or have children soon, no one was convinced. As a result, the girl decided to work as a cashier temporarily until she found a job in her speciality, because she needed to pay for housing and food, and there was nowhere to get money. At that time, her routine included early rising, a crowded bus ride across the city, and long, exhausting, monotonous work. She had to be extremely attentive to avoid any shortages being deducted from her salary. However, the most challenging aspect was dealing with people. Despite enduring rudeness, outright insults, and accusations of underperformance from customers, Michelle had to remain impeccably polite. Darcy couldn't understand why Michelle put up with it all. "If I were you, I'd have left this damn job a long time ago," Darcy said. The two were friends again, primarily because Darcy had fallen out with her parents and needed a place to stay. Darcy worked as an accountant in a firm where her father had secured her a job. With her parents' support, Darcy led a life of relative ease, which made it hard for her to understand Michelle's struggles. Michelle yearned for a strong, reliable, wise and faithful man to share her burdens, but finding such a man seemed hard. But to her great surprise, Darcy managed to find a decent man at work. Art was the head of a department, and he constantly took Darcy on dates to restaurants, complimented her, gave her expensive gifts, and eventually proposed. Michelle was genuinely happy for her friend. However, she felt her own loneliness and worthlessness more acutely against this backdrop. Michelle attended Darcy's wedding. The groom's friends were interested in the attractive bridesmaid, but they all had partners, leaving Michelle alone as usual. One of Art's friends caught Michelle in a narrow corridor, pressed her against him, and whispered an obscene suggestion to become his mistress, promising material wealth. Michelle pushed him away, her mood completely soured. Of course, in searching her soulmate, Michelle also tried online dating. She stated in her profile that she was only interested in serious, long-term relationships with the potential for marriage. This probably deterred some unsuitable candidates, but unfortunately not all. Michelle had a series of unsuccessful dates. She could probably write an interesting book, or at least a lengthy article, about them. "You must have been acting a bit wrong," Darcy said thoughtfully to Michelle. "There's no such thing as everyone being a jerk. It just doesn't happen." Michelle was hurt by Darcy's words. She had hoped for support and understanding, but Darcy had implied that she was to blame for her problems, not the men. Michelle wondered if Darcy was right. After all, she seemed to have it all. She was working in her chosen profession, was married, had her own home, and was expecting a baby. But despite Darcy's harsh words, Michelle was happy for her friend's success and desperately hoped that one day she would also be lucky. However, at the moment, her life was chaotic, filled with loneliness, financial struggles, and a monotonous job. When Darcy had her baby, the friends started seeing each other more frequently. Darcy, now a tired young mother, was struggling to cope with the baby and her unhelpful husband. She was also upset with her parents, who had promised to help with the baby, but were nowhere to be found after the birth. They themselves asked for grandchildren. Both my parents and my mother-in-law promised to help, but as soon as I gave birth, they disappeared. I'm struggling all alone with the baby. I'm not eating enough. I'm not sleeping enough. The baby is so cranky. I can't take it anymore. Michelle initially began helping Darcy with the baby once a week, and her friend appreciated her visits. Darcy would make tea, offer treats, and take a bath while Michelle cared for the baby. However, with time, Darcy started calling Michelle more frequently for help due to various reasons, such as needing to go to the dentist or the stores. Michelle, despite being tired from her own work and household chores, always put aside her tasks to help her friend. After all, Darcy was the only close friend Michelle had, and she didn't want to lose her. And anyway, friends are supposed to help each other out. That's what friendship is, Michelle thought. But she always felt awkward in the presence of Darcy's husband. Yuri seemed dissatisfied with his wife and the frequent presence of her friend in their apartment. Occasionally, they would argue in front of Michelle, leaving her feeling embarrassed. Yuri and Darcy would accuse each other of being lazy and lacking support. Before the birth of their baby, Michelle thought their family was perfect. Perhaps it was just an illusion. And then a real problem happened in Michelle's life. During a cash register audit at the supermarket, a significant shortage was discovered. Michelle was accused of stealing that money. Upon hearing that accusation, she was stunned and felt nauseous. She didn't have that kind of money. And she would have to work for 6 months for free to pay it all back. And not to eat, not to drink, not to pay the rent. So how can this be? Michelle tried to defend herself to her boss. It must be a mistake. I couldn't have let this happen. I'm careful with my work. I've been working for you for a long time, and nothing like this has ever happened. Well, it's happened now. The supervisor looked at Michelle accusingly, creating a distance between them. She was usually friendlier to her as a long-time employee. What do we do now? What do you mean, what? Pay off the shortfall. Otherwise you're facing a criminal case for embezzlement or theft. I'm not sure how they classify it now. Either way, you're in big trouble. But I don't have that kind of money. Maybe I can pay it back gradually. I could give you half of my salary until it's paid off. The boss shook her head. The money must be in the cashier's office soon. The whole sum. No installments. But where will I get that amount of money? I don't know. Borrow from someone or take out a loan. At this moment, her phone beeped insistently in her jeans pocket, displaying Darcy's name on the screen. Hi, need babysitting again. She needs babysitting again, Michelle guessed, and suddenly a thought struck her. Of course, Darcy. She has often boasted about having a financial cushion for her maternity leave. She will surely help me out, and I will try to pay her back as soon as possible. That's the solution. Michelle! Darcy's tired voice sounded over the phone, a baby's demanding cry in the background. Michelle, I need to go out for a couple of hours this evening. Can you come over after work to babysit my son? I will. Thank you. You're the best friend I've ever had. Michelle was confident that Darcy would assist her in her problem, especially as she had the means to do so. That's the situation, Michelle said after sharing all the story. I'm in a tough spot, and you're the only one who can help me. It was uncomfortable for Michelle to ask, but she felt she had no other choice. Yet upon hearing her request, Darcy tensed up and fidgeted in her chair. Michelle, I'm sorry, but I can't help you, Darcy replied finally. Why not? Michelle couldn't believe. Why? Darcy began, sounding annoyed. First, Art and I have a mortgage. His job isn't always stable, so we're slowly using my savings. Plus, we have a baby. Diapers, formula. You don't realize how expensive it all is. I understand. Michelle nodded, her last hope for a solution fading. Darcy couldn't help her, and it was terribly disappointing. Can you still babysit, despite my refusal? Darcy asked, looking down. Of course. How could you ever think otherwise? We're friends, Michelle assured her. In the end, Michelle had to take out a loan. Her already frugal lifestyle became even more stringent. She took on another part-time job, worked day and night, and spent her spare time caring for Darcy's child. Meanwhile, Darcy acquired a new car straight from the showroom. With great delight, she described its merits to Michelle, who listened, nodded and smiled, all the while trying not to think about how Darcy had explained just weeks before that she couldn't help her because her savings had almost depleted and she and Art were struggling. It turned out that Darcy could have lent her friend money, but she didn't do it. Michelle understood that Darcy should not have to sacrifice her dream of a new car for her sake. After all, how Darcy spent her money was her business. She owed Michelle nothing, so there was no reason for Michelle to take offence. And Michelle wasn't offended. She still visited Darcy in her spare time to help with the baby, making sure her friend knew she wasn't alone. The summer and beautiful golden autumn flew by quickly, and cold weather arrived. It was then that Michelle realised she had nothing to wear. Her old jacket was in disrepair, stained with a mark that refused to wash out. She urgently needed new clothes, but how could she afford them? All of Michelle's salary went towards rent and loan payments. She survived on bread, cheap pasta and canned food. Nevertheless, she needed to wear something. Darcy suggested, "Go to the flea market." "What? asked Michelle, not understanding. Well, there's one near the station, where the old fountain used to be, remember? People gather there to sell used items. I'm sure you'll find something. The next weekend, Michelle decided to visit that flea market. Initially, she was put off by the name, assuming the items would be dirty and untidy. However, she was pleasantly surprised. The market was filled with tall stalls, similar to a regular market, and the items were quite decent. Dishes, clothes, toys and antiques. Michelle felt as if she was walking through a museum. There were old plastic puppets, books in shabby bindings, and even a gramophone, a true rarity. Michelle's main interest was outerwear. She eventually found the right row, filled with bright short jackets, quality down jackets, and even fur coats. A beautiful, soft blue coat immediately caught Michelle's eye. It was elegant, stylish, and appeared to be in like-new condition, with no scuffs, stains, or holes. Plus, it seemed to be the right size. The seller turned out to be a woman in her 50s. "You seem to like the coat," she smiled. "Try it on. I think it will fit you. I can tell it's your style, and I've got an eye for these things." Michelle tried on the coat and found the saleswoman was right. It suited her figure. She even admired herself in the mirror. When the saleswoman stated the price, Michelle was astonished. It was inexpensive. She could easily afford the beautiful coat and couldn't believe her luck. Eventually, Michelle left the flea market in the sky blue coat. The weather had turned cold, and she didn't want to wear her old thin jacket after trying on the elegant coat. Dressed in the beautiful clothes, Michelle felt more confident, relaxed and happy. It seemed like a small thing, but it greatly affected her mood. She felt as if everyone was looking at her admiringly. And perhaps they were. A pretty girl with a slight smile on her lips, wearing a beautiful coat, would certainly attract attention. Michelle decided to exit the bus early and walk to her house, planning to buy something tasty from the store on the way. It's okay to treat yourself once in a while. As Michelle was hurrying to the grocery store, she heard someone's voice. Slowly, Michelle turned around and saw a gypsy girl on the deserted sidewalk. She was tall, swarthy, with a white-toothed smile. She wore a shawl from under which a long black braid, adorned with beads and thin ribbons, peeked out. A short jacket, a floor-length skirt, and bulky sneakers completed her look. "Let me guess your future, pretty one." Probably she's a bad fortune-teller, if she can't see that her potential client has no money at all, thought Michelle. "I'll just do fortune-telling," the girl suddenly said, examining Michelle with her black eyes. "Free fortune-telling. I'm just learning. I need to practice." Michelle grinned, suspecting the girl was a young con artist. "I see you don't trust me," the gypsy girl clucked her tongue. Well, well, then I'll tell you a bit about your past. Then you'll realize that I'm not deceiving you." "Well, I'm listening." Michelle relaxed for some reason. The girl was so sweet, so friendly, that she completely put her at ease. "I see that life isn't easy for you. I see loneliness, past losses. Oh, they were very close to you. Your parents, probably, yes?" The fortune-teller looked sympathetically at Michelle, who nodded affirmatively. Surprisingly, the girl accurately read her past. "But you didn't give up. You didn't break. You're strong," continued the young gypsy. "And you won't break. You're alone now, and it's hard. Just know that your life will soon change. It's already starting to change. You just don't see it yet." "Really?" Michelle looked hopefully at the gypsy. "Of course. I see that you'll have money soon. Lots of money. You'll forget about poverty once and for all. You'll have luck soon." "I wish I had," smiled Michelle. "I like your prediction. I wish it would happen soon." "It will be soon," replied the young gypsy seriously. "I see that you're skeptical, but want to believe. You'll remember my words. However, it's not money that will bring you happiness. It's something else. Later, a little later, you'll meet your man. He's already searching for you. He'll find you soon. You'll be happy. Oh, I see babies. Shall I tell you how many you'll have?" "No, I'd rather leave it as a surprise." Michelle was warmed by the novice fortune-teller's prophecies, and tears began to gather in her eyes. Perhaps she simply confused Michelle's dreams with her future. That was all. "No, I'm not mistaken to that extent," protested the gypsy. Michelle shuddered with surprise. Had she read my mind? She wondered, feeling goosebumps crawl down her back. "And when? When will all this happiness suddenly befall me?" she asked. "I'll give you a hint, even though it's a bit intrusive. You'll figure it out eventually. It's all about your new coat. Examine it at home. Be cautious," the gypsy suggested. "Wow," Michelle smiled. "And what should I look for?" "You'll find out," the gypsy woman replied evasively. "I've told you too much already. Everything's going to be fine. Don't be afraid, and believe in the good." "All right, thank you." The gypsy girl waved goodbye and hurried away. Michelle watched her until she disappeared behind the trees. She didn't believe in the fortune-teller's prediction, but nevertheless, she examined her coat when she got home. She searched the pockets, scrutinized the collar, and probed the lining. Suddenly, she felt a rustling piece of paper. Could it be a large bill? The gypsy did promise money, Michelle thought. What if the old coat's previous owner hid something valuable in it? Carefully, she ripped open the lining and reached inside, pulling out not a large bill, as she had hoped, but a piece of paper. The quick scrawling handwriting on the scrap of paper took her by surprise. It seemed like a treasure hunt guide. The gypsy had promised wealth. However, the contents of the note shocked Michelle. "Please help," read the young woman. "This is not a joke or an evil prank. I've been kidnapped. I'm locked up in a basement, forced to repair old items, which I believe he sells. I'm in a village not far from the city. I don't know the name, but I saw a sign that says 153 kilometers. The house is on the outskirts of the village. It's always quiet here. No one lives nearby. Immediately behind the house is a forest, or a garden. I can't identify it. I fear he'll kill me, like he did the others. Please, save me." Michelle's breath hitched, her hands shook, and her temples throbbed. The person who wrote this was in danger, gripped by a fear she couldn't fathom. What should she do? Michelle had no doubt the note was a genuine plea for help. She made the only decision she thought was right. She put on her new coat and went to the nearest police station. Initially, no one paid attention to Michelle and her case. "Kids are just playing around, can't you see?" An overweight policeman with tired, reddened eyes told her. "These pranks are ridiculous. I've seen many pranksters in my time." But Michelle was persistent. She knew that she was the man's only hope. The person who wrote the secret message was relying on her. Only Michelle could save him from his captivity. She needed to act fast. She didn't know how long the note had been in her coat. It could already be too late, but she refused to entertain that thought. Finally, a young officer agreed to take Michelle's statement. "Ben, what a fool you are, taking on unnecessary problems." His older colleagues scolded him. But the man listened to Michelle, recorded her statement, took her note, and personally escorted her out, promising to keep her updated. Michelle repeatedly asked Ben if he was merely trying to dismiss an intrusive visitor, but he reassured her that everything would be handled appropriately, leaving her with no choice but to trust him. She had done all she could. Now it was up to the law enforcement officials. Only 4 days after Michelle's visit, the same operative called her for a meeting. She had to take a day off work, a luxury she could scarcely afford. "Thanks to you, a significant case has been solved." Ben greeted Michelle with a friendly smile. "Have you heard about Pamela McKechnie?" Michelle nodded. Everyone knew about Pamela McKechnie. Her father was a notable figure in town, co-owner of the major metallurgical plant and a deputy. Wealthy, famous, influential. His daughter Pamela had disappeared 3 months prior. Despite having a driver and a security guard, the 16-year-old girl, who was studying at a prestigious language school, vanished on her way from school to her car. No one understood how that could happen. There were numerous theories. Many thought that Mr. McKechnie's rivals decided to manipulate him through his daughter with a carefully planned kidnapping. However, if she were kidnapped for ransom or coercion, the culprits would have already given their demands to the distressed father, yet they remained silent. Another theory was that Pamela ran away. The child sought freedom from her influential father, overbearing mother, bodyguards, chauffeurs, and endless routines. This version, which seemed the most romantic, was avidly discussed on social media because it was reminiscent of a TV series or movie. Despite extensive searching, Mr. McKechnie could not find any trace of Pamela. In desperation, he posted citywide ads promising large rewards for any information about his daughter. "So, was it Pamela who wrote that note in my coat?" she asked. The investigator nodded, his smile broadening. "We saved the girl just in time. She's alive and well. She's in the hospital, suffering from exhaustion and a nervous breakdown. But her father will provide excellent rehabilitation, and she'll be back to her old self in no time. There are some papers for you to sign. Your statement played a crucial role in saving the girl." Michelle felt goosebumps on her back. Wow, if I hadn't bought that coat and met a gypsy on the way— a gypsy? She deserves gratitude too. Without her words, who knows when I would have discovered the note under the lining. Maybe I wouldn't have found it at all. Or I might have washed the coat, making the text unreadable. Michelle decided to ponder this thought later. Right now, she was more interested in the details of the rescue. What happened to Pamela? Why did she disappear? "That's a story," said the investigator, pulling a pack of cigarettes from his pocket. He looked at Michelle and asked, "Do you mind?" Michelle shook her head. It seemed the conversation would be a long one. But she wasn't in a rush. She had taken the whole day off. The investigator began to speak in a smooth, measured tone, revealing himself to be an excellent storyteller. From early childhood, young Pamela McKechnie was used to having her every wish immediately fulfilled. Want an expensive toy? No problem. A dress from a famous designer? Right away. Recording a music video in a real studio? Also possible. The only thing missing for Pamela was freedom. Her days were scheduled down to the minute, lessons and extracurricular activities. And Pamela was already a grown-up girl. She wanted love, friendship, freedom. She wanted to know better the world beyond the fence of the mansion. It beckoned so much, seemed so interesting, full of adventures and bright events. One day, Pamela ran away. She evaded her vigilant guards and driver after school, leaving behind the confines of her private school. She roamed the city, visiting cafes, interacting with locals, and even dancing with street musicians in an underpass. She felt incredibly happy and free. It was a wonderful day, and everyone around her seemed kind, friendly, and genuine. Her father's words, that a man is a wolf to man, seemed forced to her. She even felt she understood life better than her influential father, who, despite his maturity and seriousness, seemed to have misconceptions about the world. Then Pamela met a guy. He was tall, handsome, charming, and modest, a stark contrast to the arrogant and self-loving boys she usually interacted with at school. The stranger, who introduced himself as Tom, complimented Pamela in a way that left her head spinning. He carried a large backpack as he made his living selling second-hand items at the market. Pamela offered to help him. During the street vending, Tom shared his outstanding life story. He grew up in an orphanage, without parents, enduring many hardships throughout his childhood and teenage years. Pamela listened to his harrowing tales of poverty, street fights, and attempts to find his parents. In the evening, Pamela agreed to go with Tom to his apartment, located in an old house on the city outskirts. She already considered him a close friend. Tom, with his masterful charm, had won her trust. Without any apprehension, she got into his old rusty car. While driving, Tom offered her some water, which she gladly accepted. However, after a few sips, her world began to spin. Pamela clung to Tom's sleeve to prevent herself from falling, feeling a rush of nausea. Then everything went dark. Her memories returned in fragments. She recalled waking in the car as it veered onto a country road at a sign 153 kilometres. Then, having stopped the car, Tom pulled out the exhausted, immobilised Pamela and carried her on his shoulder into the house. Pamela noticed that the house stood on the edge of a long village street. When she fully regained consciousness, she found herself in a basement. It was dark and damp, yet equipped with necessities: a bed, a bucket toilet, and a table with a sewing machine. Tom even taught her how to operate it. He was a formidable, physically strong person. Pamela tried to escape a few times, but was easily overpowered and beaten by him. She realised that Tom was not even using his full strength. Over time she understood it was best not to resist. If she complied, he did not harm her. Every day he brought her meals. In the evenings he asked her to read him fairy tales, which was both strange and frightening. This grown man would listen to magic stories from a thick book, his mouth agape in wonder. Tom taught Pamela to mend worn-out items, which he would then sell at the market. In this work, Pamela found her key to survival. The girl proved herself quite resourceful. The policeman smiled, taking a puff from his second cigarette. She hid notes in various concealed parts of her clothing, sewing them into the lining and buttonholes. If it weren't for her quick thinking, she'd still be trapped in the basement, or worse. It appears that Pamela wasn't the first captive of this basement. Tom lured girls, made them read him fairy tales, and repaired clothes, which he sold later. Tom fed his captives, relishing his control over them. Once he got bored with his current captive, he would dispose of them and find a new one. "What a horror," Nichelle whispered. She couldn't begin to fathom the terror Pamela must have felt, alone in the basement with such a monster. "Now you understand the danger of the man you had stopped," the investigator said seriously. "You've done a great service to the world, not just to Pamela. You could have ignored the note, thrown it away and moved on. Or you could have given up when the police station didn't believe you. I know they didn't want to pay attention to your words. It's frightening to imagine if you had given up and left." Michelle nodded and shivered, feeling deeply unsettled by the existence of people like Tom. It was chilling to think that you never know who might be passing by, an average person or a monster. "Pamela's father is Mr. McKechnie. He found out about you and wants to meet you," the investigator said. "For what reason?" Michelle questioned, suddenly excited. "I think he wants to thank you," the investigator replied. "And don't you dare be shy or decline. You deserve it." It turned out that currently Mr. McKechnie was at the station. He had documents to sign and people to talk to. Michelle recognised him immediately when he entered the office. After all, she had seen him numerous times in photos and videos. Now she was seeing him in person. Mr. McKechnie walked up to Michelle silently and embraced her in a surprised fatherly hug. This influential, important man appeared so down-to-earth and genuine. Initially, Mr. McKechnie spoke about his state of mind during the months his daughter was missing. It was clear he needed to express his emotions. Michelle listened, showing empathy, nodding her head. Then it was Michelle's turn to speak. She told Mr. McKechnie about her financial troubles, her second-hand coat, and the gypsy woman. Initially she was unsure about sharing such details, fearing he wouldn't believe her and would think she was crazy. But he believed her. He believed in the gypsy and her prophetic clue. He also believed that his daughter's rescue was due to something inexplicable, incomprehensible. In a word, a miracle. "You are a good, kind, decent girl," Mr. McKechnie finally said, as their conversation was drawing to a close. The most important thing is that you are not indifferent. Your case has saved not only my Pamela, but many other girls who might have been after her. I'm sure of it. Of course, I'll thank you. You won't be in need any more. The gypsy girl was right about that too. I'll pay off your loan debt today and transfer the money to you. Of course, my gratitude can't be measured in money, but I'm pleased to think that I've helped you in some way. Mr. McKechnie kept his promise. An hour later, Michelle received a text message from her bank. She couldn't believe her eyes when she saw the amount on the screen. She was not yet used to such wealth. Michelle's life changed dramatically after becoming wealthy. She resigned from her supermarket job and searched for a new one, taking her time. She was no longer driven by poverty. She found a good job which was remote and well paid. Ironically, she started earning well when she didn't need money. Michelle was finally able to afford her long-time dreams. She got her driving license, bought a car, and purchased beautiful dresses. She even considered buying an apartment. She could afford any property in the city, but she wasn't sure she wanted to stay here. Once, she thought wealth was a guarantee of a carefree life, but she discovered that wealth was also a test. After becoming rich, Michelle was disappointed in people, especially those closest to her. Darcy was the first to distinguish herself. After leaving the police station, Michelle immediately shared her extraordinary experience with her, and soon her attitude towards Michelle changed. Darcy became more attentive, caring and polite. She frequently complimented Michelle, a stark contrast to her previous habit of teasing Michelle's appearance and behaviour. It irritated Michelle to realise that Darcy was flattering her, that she was constantly belittling herself and elevating Michelle to make her feel like a queen. Now, each of their meetings followed the same script. Darcy ordered delicacies and expensive drinks, described her miserable life in vivid detail, and hinted at her friend solving one of her problems. And Michelle, being now the wealthier one, always ended up paying the bill. And then Darcy presumptuously requested a golden jewellery set from a renowned brand as a New Year's gift. And Michelle finally realised that Darcy had always used her, and their friendship was based on doing Darcy favours. She had provided her with an apartment, written her term papers, and often babysat her child. However, when Michelle needed help to cover a debt, Darcy refused. She could have delayed her new car purchase to lend Michelle the money, but she chose not to. Looking at their friendship from a new angle, Michelle finally ended it. However, despite her wealth and a good job, she was not happy. The novelty of her affluent lifestyle had worn off, and she yearned for the company of close people who were now absent in her life. However, the second part of the prophecy gave her hope. It promised that a man who was already looking for her would bring her happiness, love, marriage, and even children. Eager to find this man, Michelle started dating. She engaged in a long romance with Keith, a man she met online, who seemed sensitive and understanding. He appeared to anticipate Michelle's thoughts and desires. But later, Michelle discovered that Keith was a graduate of a school that trained men to communicate effectively with wealthy women to achieve their goals. Michelle was aware of such schools for women, but for men? She was certainly not prepared for that. Michelle paid off Keith's loan and offered to help him, not realising that she was being skillfully led and pushed towards this decision. For New Year, she gifted him a motorcycle, fulfilling his dream of speed, wind in his ears and the roar of the engine. Eager to make her loved one happy, she also provided him with some money to develop his business. After all, it's important for a man to feel like a provider. Michelle was thrilled that her beloved would now engage in meaningful work and find his purpose. However, the business venture failed and the money vanished. Michelle consoled the disheartened Keith, urging him not to be upset. Yeah, Keith really turned out to be a worthy student. He managed to masterfully mess with his girlfriend's mind The relationship proved costly for Michelle, with the money from Mr. McKechnie evaporating like snow under the March sun. But soon Michelle was able to look at Keith without rose-coloured glasses, and she was helped in this by one of her new colleagues. Michelle often showed pictures of Keith and told a lot about him. The entire office was familiar with Michelle's boyfriend, despite never meeting him. One Monday, Meg said, "I saw your handsome boyfriend at the club on Saturday." "No, it can't be," Michelle replied. "Keith visited his mother yesterday. She lives in a neighbouring town and hasn't been feeling well, so he—" "I can tell that he has a spectacular mother," Meg said, grinning as she handed her smartphone to Michelle. On the screen was an intriguing photo. A passionate couple were caught in the dim light of a club. Keith, stylishly handsome, was pressing a striking brunette against him. It was far from a friendly embrace. Michelle stared at the couple, desperate to find evidence that the man was not Keith but a look-alike. However, it was indeed Keith in the photo that Meg had taken. He was wearing the expensive, stylish brand-name shirt Michelle herself had given him. Michelle did not begin to clarify the relationship with her partner the same evening. No, she did not want to spoil the illusion of a warm relationship, so she delayed until the last minute. However, she began to scrutinize Keith more closely, noticing details she previously overlooked. The truth about her beloved eventually emerged. Keith was a professional womanizer, living off the generosity of women. Before Michelle, he had been involved with a 60-year-old widow of a renowned businessman. He held no moral values, love or feelings. Facing the harsh reality was challenging. Michelle felt used and insignificant again. Keith was only with her for the money. It seemed that Michelle herself meant nothing. Only Mr. McKechnie's money made her attractive to both her girlfriends and men. Michelle summoned the strength and ejected Keith from her life. Although it brought some relief, oppressive thoughts still haunted her. She could no longer trust people. Her best friend was greed-ridden and materialistic. Her supposed soulmate was merely a gigolo. Everyone seemed to want only her money. It was as though Michelle herself had no existence. She was nothing. Eventually, the woman came to what she believed was a splendid decision. She would leave the city. After all, what is holding her here? Her job was remote. She could visit the office twice a week, on Mondays to collect documents, and on Fridays to submit processed paperwork. That was more than sufficient. Michelle decided to live in the house where she grew up, where she had been happy, where she belonged, and where she would find happiness again. Michelle felt the need to take a break from life, to be alone with her thoughts. She believed a slower pace, silence, and a lack of rush would help her find balance and peace of mind. Now, Michelle is sitting on her suitcases and boxes waiting for a truck. She's leaving the apartment she rented for many years. She moved in as a naive student, full of plans for a bright future. Now she's leaving as what? A successful woman? Or an unhappy, lonely, disillusioned person? Michelle couldn't answer this question. Her parents' house greeted her with closed shutters and a heavy silence. It had been a long time since her last visit, and she missed it. She looked at the cobweb-laden corners, recalling how clean and cosy it was when her mother was alive. It was sad to see the house quiet, deserted, unattended. Michelle stood up, picked up a broom, and went into the hallway. She decided to start cleaning there, and the process warmed her soul. As Michelle wiped the dust off the shelves, she realized that she would never sell this place, not for all the money in the world. Over the course of the day, several neighbours, all long-time residents, visited Michelle. One of them was Mrs. Bison. "Michelle, it's you, isn't it? Hello, darling, it's been a long time," Mrs. Bison greeted. "Yes, it's me," Michelle smiled at her neighbour, pleased to see a familiar face from her past. "You're not thinking of selling your parents' house, are you? I see you're cleaning up." "No, I'm planning to live here." "Really?" Mrs. Bison exclaimed in surprise. "I can't believe it. I heard you had a good job. Did you get fired?" No, I still have my job. I'll be working from home remotely. It's something a lot of people do nowadays. Oh, I know that, Mrs. Bison said knowledgeably. Many people work remotely now, but young people are better off in the city. There are so many opportunities. Few people come back. And you? What happened? Everything is all right. I just wanted to go home, Michelle answered sincerely. Well, of course, take a rest. Home is the best place to be. I'll bring you lunch, or you can come to us. I can see you'll be busy cleaning and won't have time to cook. Thank you very much. Michelle smiled warmly, touched by the care she received. Gradually, Michelle adjusted to her new rural life. On Mondays, she travelled into the city to collect paperwork, processed it throughout the week, and returned it by Friday evening. Her schedule was relaxed and consistent. Typically, she completed the planned paperwork by midday, leaving her afternoons free for gardening. Michelle enjoyed working with the soil, caring for the flower beds, growing beautiful flowers, and decorating her garden with lanterns, gnome, and frog figurines. And Michelle also read, sitting on the porch in a big soft armchair, which she herself had brought here from the living room. She had never had time to do that before. Now she had time, and she was eager to make up for lost time. She was reading one book after another, and even bad weather was not an obstacle to reading in the fresh air. If it became cold, Michelle simply dressed warmer and wrapped in a plaid. If it rained, she was still hidden by an awning from the rain, and enjoyed reading and the clatter of drops on the brightly coloured floor. One day, close to evening, Michelle was working in the vegetable garden. It was the very beginning of fall, Michelle's favourite time of the year. The intense heat had subsided, yet the first frosts were still a long way off. Nature was bursting with vibrant colours, and the air carried the scent of wild flowers. Evenings were becoming crisp, so Michelle wore her mother's warm sweater. Her hair was tousled, and she wore old boots on her feet. After all, she was heading to the vegetable garden, not a fashion show. Living in the countryside offered the benefit of not needing to style her hair, apply makeup, or look perfect. However, that evening, Michelle wished she had dressed a bit more appropriately. "Michelle, is that you?" A pleasant male voice unexpectedly called from behind the fence. Michelle's mind had been wandering, as it often did recently, but she turned around quickly and met the gaze of the man she had idealized throughout her childhood and adolescence. Although he wasn't a man back then, he was a child. In front of Michelle stood Brian, the person whom all the neighbours used as a positive example for their children. He was grown up, tanned, and smiling. Michelle recognised him instantly, despite not having seen him for over 10 years. How could she forget someone who had dominated her dreams for so long? Michelle vividly remembered how her heart would pound at the sight of his bright blue t-shirt in the distance. Brian was almost like a dream to her back then, handsome, intelligent, and incredibly self-assured. He was never at a loss for words, and always knew what to say and to whom. After high school, Brian moved to the capital to study at a university and became a paediatric surgeon. At least that's what the neighbours said. Brian never returned here. Instead, his parents moved to their son to the capital themselves. It was said that Brian bought an apartment for them, close to his own. "How lucky they are," the neighbours would say. "What a fine son they've raised. Respected, wealthy, a doctor, and considerate of his elders." This Brian should be in the capital now, leading the busy life of a successful man. So how had he ended up here, near her fence? Of all people, Brian was the last person Michelle expected to see here. It was astonishing, like a dream come true. "Hi," Michelle managed to smile, hoping no dirt was on her face, a common mishap for her. "You haven't changed much," Brian commented as he approached the fence. "Why are you here? I heard about your parents, I'm sorry." "Yes, my parents are gone," Michelle confirmed. "I understand. I often dream of escaping to a deserted island, but my parents need me. That's the only thing holding me back. You're a surgeon, I hear. A paediatric cardiac surgeon, Brian clarified. Michelle found herself looking at his fingers, the slender, long fingers. No one would believe that Brian grew up in the village, and these very hands chopped wood and milked a cow and carried heavy weights. And I work as a manager. I work remotely, which allows me to live here. How do you like it? Are you content with this life? Brian looked intently into Michelle's eyes, compelling her to tell the truth. Well, of course, I like everything. Listen, why are we standing here? Why don't you come in if you're not in a hurry? Or sit on the patio. I'll make you tea with raspberry leaves. I remember you used to like that when you were a kid. I still do, I guess, smiled Brian. I haven't drunk it for a long time, though, and I've forgotten the taste, I think. They sat on the patio under the rapidly darkening sky. Michelle switched on a lantern, and in its light the gnats and moths danced their eternal dances. Large and bright stars lit up one after another in the sky, the kind you can only see in the countryside. Michelle wanted this moment to last as long as possible, with Brian sitting next to her, speaking in his lulling, pleasant voice. He was so special. Michelle hadn't realized her childhood feelings were still alive. Maybe her relationships with other men didn't work out because she unconsciously compared them with Brian. Brian exuded warmth and acceptance, which Michelle could physically feel. She sensed that he, too, was pleased to sit with her and talk as if no long years of separation had occurred. You know, Brian suddenly confessed, of everyone in the village, I found you the most interesting to talk to. You were always so thoughtful and understanding. That's very nice to hear, Michelle sincerely responded. Brian began to talk about his life. He resided in the city, devoting most of his time to work, teaching students and studying. He was constantly learning new things, honing his skills, and practicing with experienced professors and surgeons. Brian excelled in handling the most challenging cases and sought out such patience, enjoying the difficult tasks. When Brian spoke about his work, his eyes sparkled. Michelle smiled. It was clear that he loved his job. Brian had found his path, his place in life. He came to the village because his parents asked him to take some things from the house. How about you? Tell me about yourself. There's not much to tell, really, shrugged Michelle. In comparison to Brian's life, her own seemed somewhat grey, uninteresting, almost meaningless. I lived and worked in the city, and I'm tired, so I came here to rest and rejuvenate. You're home alone? So, you don't have a husband and children? Brian asked, immediately becoming embarrassed. Oh, I'm sorry, that was a tactless question. No, it wasn't, Michelle smiled. She was pleased that Brian showed interest in her personal life. You're right, I don't have children or a husband. I'm alone. Brian smiled understandingly. I'm also alone. I recently ended a strange and difficult relationship, but I don't feel lonely. I feel free, even liberated. This confession pleased Michelle. She even had to avert her eyes so that Brian would not notice the impression his words made on her. Michelle remembered a prophecy that soon she would meet her true love. Her heart told her that this time there would be no disappointment. Everything would finally be right, good, and as it should be. Tricia looked at the note for what felt like the 10th time. The handwriting was legible, but the content was crushing. Tricia, I'm sorry, but I can't go on like this. I've fallen in love with another woman, and today she and I are leaving for another city. Don't look for us. Tell the kids I love them. Hector. The woman slowly sank back into her chair, fingering the note as though that small scrap of paper could offer any comfort. "It just can't be," Tricia muttered quietly. She had noticed something strange about Hector lately, but didn't want to believe it. It's true that a wife is the last person who finds out about her husband's infidelity. He used to tell her that he worked hard, that he was tired. He'd stay out late and be gone all weekend. Even the children seemed to suspect something, especially their eldest, Zach, who was now 14. Tricia knew that at his age, he could understand that his parents didn't love each other and were together only because of necessity. Yet in front of the children, the woman maintained the play about a happy family. "Daddy just works hard," she'd answer their questions, smiling to make it believable. "He does it for us." She noticed Zach's skeptical frown, but he didn't question her further, likely to spare his younger siblings. Or perhaps he believed the adults would resolve it themselves. Tricia had long been tortured by suspicions, and she did her best to ignore them. She found long blonde hairs on her husband's car seat, even though her own hair was dark walnut-coloured and had been cut short. Just giving a ride to one of his co-workers, Tricia explained her suspicious finding. She also rationalised the smell of another woman's perfume on his clothes, the late-night messages, and the evasive looks from his friends. Why, she thought, clutching the note in her hands, why did I justify him when everything was so obvious? But the reason was easy. She was used to trusting him, or perhaps, and she had never lied to Hector, even about minor matters, throughout their 15-year marriage. Or maybe she was just terrified of shattering their stable world that she had grown so accustomed to over the years. "Don't trouble trouble until trouble troubles you," Tricia's grandmother used to say. Tricia did just that, pretending everything was as it used to be, until Hector took the first step. "Mum, what are we having for dinner tonight?" Zach asked, peering into the kitchen. He had a knack for sensing her mood, and immediately realised something was off. Tricia flinched, attempting to hide the note, but her son snatched it from her hands after reading it for a few seconds. He sighed maturely, not surprised, as though he had long been prepared for such a situation. "I see. Have you called him yet?" "Why?" "What do you mean, why?" the eldest son responded, sitting next to her. Among all the children, he resembled Tricia the most, with dark hazel hair, expressive green eyes, and a straight, neat nose. But unlike the gentle Tricia, Zach was serious and wise beyond his years, as if he was preparing to take on the role of family head. "You'll have to discuss divorce, alimony, and who's going to pay for the flat. We still have a mortgage for 5 more years. "You're probably right. I should talk to him about it. It's just that I don't believe it's real yet." Her son sighed, covering her hand with his. "I understand, Mum. This is very difficult for you right now. But we both knew this was going to happen at some point. How long has he been cheating on you? 3 years? 5 years?" Tricia recoiled. "I don't know, and let's not discuss that. You'd better call your younger sister and brother to dinner." Zach stood up. "Okay, you're not going to tell them yet, right?" "No, I'll contact your father first." Tricia crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. However, despite her attempts, Hector didn't answer any calls or texts. At his work, Tricia was told that he had resigned a few days ago. Tricia also called some of his friends, and they didn't know anything either. The woman gazed thoughtfully out the window. The children were asleep, giving her time to deliberate on her next steps. After Alicia, their youngest daughter, was born 7 years ago, it became apparent that Tricia would not be able to go to work for a long time. "What's the point?" her husband had asked. "Even if you work double shifts at the hospital, your salary won't cover expenses for babysitting, cleaning, cooking. Someone has to take care of the children and the house while you are at work." Tricia sighed, acknowledging that nurses were not so well paid. Why don't you focus on the house and the children? I'm sure we'll manage financially." So she heeded her husband's advice and resigned from the hospital where she had worked for many years. There was a shortage of nurses, and her responsible, careful nature was greatly valued, making her departure a significant loss. She hadn't wanted to quit. She enjoyed her work, but juggling it with caring for her husband and children was challenging. After leaving her job, Tricia initially felt lost. Now, her mornings were spent taking Alicia and Brandon to kindergarten and Zach to school. She would then go to the grocery shop, wash dishes, tidy up toys, do laundry, sweep and mop the floors. By the time lunch was ready, it was time to fetch the younger ones from kindergarten. Picking up Zach from school used to be part of her routine, but once Brandon started attending kindergarten, Zach protested. "I'm an adult now," he told his mother. "I can walk to school by myself." "You're only 9, Tricia objected. Zach just furrowed his eyebrows stubbornly. "The school is near the house. You already have 2 children to pick up from kindergarten, and then there's me. I'm embarrassed to walk with my mum, like a little kid, honestly." His mother sighed and agreed. Once Zach decided he was unyielding. Over time, Tricia assimilated into this home life routine and could hardly remember her working days. Their income from Hector was sufficient, and he was content to return to a clean house, a hot dinner, and well cared-for children after work. And his wife no longer smelled of iodine and other medicine. However, now Tricia was at a loss about what to do. She hadn't worked for 7 years. They still had a few more years to pay off the mortgage for their apartment. The money she had could last for a month or 2 if they cut all expenses. She hoped Hector would come to his senses and call, but she had a gut feeling that wouldn't happen. What should she do then? Where should she get money? Tricia had no one to help her. She didn't know her father, and her mother had passed away 5 years ago. "I need to find a job," Tricia thought, "or we'll end up on the street." The woman sitting across from Tricia glanced at her resume again and sighed heavily. She pushed her heavy metal-rimmed glasses down to the tip of her nose. It was nearly the end of the workday, and the employment officer wanted to get it over with and go home as soon as possible. But now she had to deal with this situation. A 30-year-old woman, the mother of 3, who hadn't worked for 7 years, having last been a nurse in a hospital. "I don't know what to suggest to you," she said. "I assume a daily duty or even full-time work wouldn't suit you." Tricia sighed and gestured dismissively. The woman snorted in displeasure. "Then I have nothing to offer you." "Nothing at all?" Tricia asked for clarification. "Yes," she said briefly, but seeing the look of desperation on Tricia's face, the woman tried to reassure. "I still have your phone number. If anything comes up, I'll call you." "Thank you," Tricia said, smiling before she walked out and carefully closed the door behind her. Once outside, she got into her old black Toyota, a car she had purchased before her marriage. Leaning back in the driver's seat, Tricia exhaled slowly. "It's okay," she muttered to herself. "I'll overcome everything." She mentally counted her remaining money. It was enough to last another month. She had already minimized her expenses, but didn't want to compromise on her children's needs. However, if she couldn't secure a job, she'd have to cut back on her activities. She considered selling her belongings. Her clothes and shoes weren't particularly valuable, but she could pawn her jewelry, laptop, and perhaps the TV in her bedroom. But what's next? Would she have to take the full-time job? What about the kids? Leave them alone from morning till night? Of course, Zach is 14, Brandon is 10, and Alicia is 7. They are not babies, and Zach has been saying that he can cope with the younger ones, feed them, take them out of school, make them do their homework. Only, do I have the right to put the responsibilities of adulthood on his shoulders so early? But 2 weeks later, Tricia had a sudden phone call. Hello? She said carefully into the receiver, a sense of dread creeping over her as she anticipated an offer for some credit or a tale of a suspicious transaction on her card. Unexpectedly, the pleasant female voice on the other end surprised her. Hello, my name is Mary Austin. Your number was given to me by the employment service. Are you still looking for a job? Yes, Tricia replied hastily, embarrassed by her own impulsiveness. Good. The woman seemed genuinely pleased. It says here you have many years of experience as a nurse, and you have worked with critically ill patients? That's correct, Tricia confirmed. I'd like to ask, would you consider a position as a caregiver? Tricia hesitated for a moment. She had never worked as a caregiver, but she reasoned it couldn't be much harder than nursing. If she could manage an entire ward, she could certainly handle one seriously ill person. I would need to know all the conditions first, she answered cautiously. Of course, I'll tell you everything, Mary Austin promised. Would it be convenient for you to come to my office tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock? Yes, of course. Great. I'll text you the address. See you tomorrow. I'll be waiting for you. Goodbye, Tricia replied, ending the call. Her heart pounded inexplicably. It was too early to celebrate, but the spark of hope had been reignited. After dropping the kids off at school, she drove to the appointment. Along the way, she replayed potential answers to any questions she might be asked and noted down her own queries on her phone. The office was in the city centre, inside a huge modern business centre. As Tricia stepped into the immaculate, almost silent elevator, she surmised that Mary Austin must work for some very affluent people. Good afternoon, who are you? A young, pretty girl, likely a secretary, greeted her in the reception area. I have an appointment here for an interview at 10 in the morning, Tricia informed her, for the position of caregiver. Oh, the girl replied, surprised, yet sympathetic. But she quickly regained her composure and smiled politely. Please sit down. I'll check everything. Tricia sat down and the secretary called on the phone and asked something quietly and quickly into the receiver. The answer was apparently positive. She then stood up, smiled at Tricia again and said, Miss Austin is expecting you. Please come in. Tricia was escorted like royalty. She was slightly unsettled, doubting a mere nurse could receive such treatment. She even wondered if there had been a mix-up. Hello, Tricia said briefly as she entered the office. Mary Austin was an attractive woman around Tricia's age. She had black hair tied neatly in a low ponytail, an expensive pair of glasses, and was clad in a business suit. Good afternoon. Please, have a seat. She gestured to a soft chair opposite hers. Our records show you have extensive experience as a nurse, including care for critically ill patients. You're also interested in a caregiver position, the woman asked. That's correct. Good. I represent the interests of a client who needs such a caregiver. He has been paralysed below the waist for several years and suffers from several cardiovascular, respiratory and digestive diseases, Mary explained. Tricia nodded, showing she was attentively listening. Physically, your work won't be strenuous. The entire house is adapted for my client's needs. It has a motorised wheelchair, elevators, handrails, etc. Medical tasks will be simple. Injections, pills, drips, and so on. Nothing you wouldn't know how to do as a nurse. I see, Tricia said. Mary paused, as if choosing her words carefully for her next question. Then she asked, I guess you have children? Tricia swallowed. From that moment, the woman at the employment centre began to look at her in such a way that it became clear that she would never get a job. But there was no point in lying. I have 3, Tricia replied. Mary nodded thoughtfully. They're all in school? And they'll be on vacation soon, right? Yes, in a couple of weeks. Are you considering a residential option? My client's house is out of town, it would be inconvenient for you to commute daily. Tricia shook her head. I don't have anyone to leave my children with, she said sadly, expecting to be dismissed. But Mary said, You don't have to leave them. You and your children will live together on the estate, in the outbuilding. It's a separate, cosy building. I assure you, you'll like it. Tricia looked at her incredulously. Are you saying that we can live in the tenant's house for free? Mary nodded and smiled. Additionally, you won't have to cook. The meals are free, as is the lodging. You'll eat with the rest of the staff. That sounds tempting, Tricia said cautiously, suspecting a catch. Exactly, Mary confirmed cheerfully. Would you like to know the work hours and wages? I would, Tricia replied cautiously, and Mary swiped across her tablet screen and turned it toward Tricia, whose eyes widened. This is the weekly pay, she explained. In a week? Tricia was even more surprised. So much. Yes, Mary sighed a little too humanly, distracting from her flawless business image. I understand you're expecting a catch, and there is one. Tricia pressed her lips together, slowly nodded, and looked questioningly at Mary, who removed her glasses and tiredly rubbed the bridge of her nose. My client is a unique individual with a challenging character. Not everyone can get along with him, Mary said finally. Tricia exhaled in relief. That's it? I've encountered all sorts of people in my years at the hospital. We didn't receive additional pay for dealing with difficult personalities. It's not quite that simple. I can't guarantee a stable work schedule. Essentially, if my client decides he needs you at 2 a.m., you will have to wake up and be there. But everything you'd mentioned before is accurate? Yes. The salary, as I previously mentioned, is paid weekly due to high staff turnover. You and your children will live in a separate building and have meals provided. If you or the children need transportation, a car with a driver will be available. So, in return, I must care for an irritable elderly millionaire and be ready to serve at any moment. You could say that. I'm ready, replied Tricia. When can we start? After some time spent on paperwork and waiting for the children's holiday to start, they finally packed up and headed to Mr. Arnold's estate. Mum, is he some sort of madman? Brendan asked. We're going to an isolated place. Tricia flushed, aware that the driver Frank was listening. He had been sent by her new employer. Brandon, Tricia scolded. We're not just going anywhere. It's a closed settlement. Mr. Arnold is an ordinary person. Please mind your words when you meet him. This job is crucial to me. Mr. Arnold will likely only meet you, Frank interjected. He isn't fond of new people. Also, he instructed me to take you directly to the outbuilding. I see, responded Tricia. Shortly afterward, they arrived at the settlement. Wow, Brandon explained. If there are people living here, they must be very wealthy. Brandon, Zach chuckled, while Alicia almost hit her forehead against the glass, straining to see everything. Once they drove through the entire settlement, they reached a large area enclosed by an elegant yet tall wrought iron fence. The driver pressed a button on a small black remote and the gate swung open. We are now entering the estate grounds, Frank commented. They drove for a while along a road lined with neatly trimmed trees. A massive modern house made of glass and metal loomed ahead. However, the car veered left and didn't head towards the mansion. A few minutes later, they pulled up to a small, tiny wooden house. Upon entering inside, Tricia noticed that despite its compact exterior, the house was surprisingly spacious inside. The small entryway led directly into a living room that also served as a kitchen and dining room. A large ensuite bathroom was available, and, most importantly, there were 4 bedrooms. Wow! Brandon squealed. Am I getting my own bedroom? Tricia smiled. It appears so. In their apartment, the brothers shared a room, while only Alicia had her own. Zack gazed at his mother and smiled. He's all grown up now, thought Tricia suddenly. He needed a separate room a long time ago. Meanwhile, Frank had already brought in all their things and said, Settle down, rest. They'll probably call you for dinner in about an hour. That's when you'll meet everyone. Thank you, Frank, said Tricia sincerely. He smiled. It was a pleasure to meet you all. I hope you enjoy it here and decide to stay. In the hour they had, everyone managed to unpack their things and start getting used to their new surroundings. Mummy, I really like it here, exclaimed Alicia, running up to Tricia and hugging her legs. Tricia smiled and stroked her daughter's hair. I'm very glad, she said. I hope you won't get bored here while I work. Just then there was a knock at the door, and a tall, fair-haired, brown-eyed man entered the cottage. He was dressed simply in a white t-shirt and black jeans, but his confident demeanour suggested that he played a significant role there. Good afternoon, everyone, he greeted first. My name is Nick. I'm Mr. Arnold's assistant and the manager of this house. Pleased to meet you, she replied. My name is Tricia, and these are my children, Zack, Brandon and Alicia. How do you do? Greeted the children in unison. Nick smiled. I'm very glad. I'm sure you'll liven up our sleepy kingdom. Now, let's all go have lunch. He led them down a path that led to the side entrance of the mansion. Through this door they entered a large, cosy kitchen. Here are our newcomers, greeted a cheerful woman's voice. Tricia saw a slightly overweight woman in her 50s. I'm Sarah, she said. I'm in charge of food in this house. Please join us at the table. Tricia introduced herself and the children, and they took their seats at the table. There were about 10 other people there, all employees of the manor. They introduced themselves to Tricia, but she was so nervous that she merely smiled and nodded in response. Nick sat to Tricia's right. Don't worry, he whispered in her ear. You'll remember everyone in a couple of days. How do you know what I was thinking? Tricia asked. It's not difficult. When I got a job here myself and everyone was introduced to me, I thought the same thing. Tricia grinned. Her initial fear had subsided. Everyone seemed very nice and friendly, and the kids were well behaved. After lunch, Nick took Tricia to meet the boss, while Frank volunteered to give the children a tour of the estate. When Nick and Tricia stopped in front of the office door, her employer's assistant looked her gently in the eyes and said, Tricia, remember any comments that Mr. Arnold makes are not personal. He is just an elderly man with a difficult past and a bad temper. That's why we're offering you a good salary and luxury conditions. Thank you for saying that, Nick, but don't worry, I'm tougher than I look. I'm sure you are. Nick smiled, and then he knocked and opened the door. At last, came a creaky old voice. I thought I was going to die in here before any of you decided to come in. I wonder why I pay you all such a high salary. In a chair by the window sat an old, hunched man. Tricia immediately thought he was the type of character depicted in books as an evil old relative to a poor orphan. It was clear that Mr. Arnold was once a tall and robust man, but age had made him frail, drawing him closer to the ground. His shoulders remained broad, even a little proudly so. With his short grey hair, stubble, long straight nose, tightly closed lips, and eyes that were angry and prickly, he looked at Tricia coldly. His eyes, once probably blue or green, were now so faded it was hard to tell. With those eyes, he studied Tricia as if scanning her, checking what was inside her. Who is it? He asked Nick, ignoring Tricia as if she weren't capable of answering. This is Tricia, Nick replied. She'll be your new nurse. Hello, nice to meet you, Mr. Arnold, Tricia said, unwilling to stand around waiting to be addressed. The old man frowned unhappily as if he had tasted something sour. "Yes," he said. "They get worse every time. Fine. Nick, we'll see how we can work with her later." The assistant gave Tricia one last smile and left. Without Nick, Tricia instantly felt vulnerable, but she was unwavering in her decision to not let her mentee ruin her mood. She needed this job. She liked the cozy house where they were located, and she appreciated not having to go anywhere. And she certainly had no plans to leave within a week. So, Tricia composed herself, smiled, and said, "Well, where should we start? Maybe I should shave you first. You look more like a homeless man than a millionaire." Why did I say that? She thought in horror. I wanted to discuss my skills, how I'm a highly qualified nurse. Now he's going to fire me for sure. Mr. Arnold raised his thick eyebrows and unexpectedly burst into laughter. "Like a homeless man," he exclaimed. "Well, if that's the case, lead me to the bathroom." "Where's your bathroom?" she asked. The old man rolled his eyes. "Now, that's professionalism at its best." He pressed a button on the arm of his chair and started moving. Tricia had no choice but to follow him. Mr. Arnold led her to a large, spacious room. Tricia had a few seconds to take in her surroundings and was amazed at how conveniently everything was arranged. She found a cape, shaving foam, and a shaving machine. "Do you even know how to use these?" Mr. Arnold asked doubtfully. "I do," Tricia replied calmly. The last time she used it was a while back, when she was still working at the hospital. One of the patients asked her to shave him before neck surgery because he couldn't do it himself. His hands were shaking. "I'll manage," Tricia thought. After finishing her work, she looked at the result with satisfaction. "There," she said, turning her ward towards the mirror. "An entirely different look." Mr. Arnold saw himself and was aghast. "What have you done, you fool?" he shouted. "Couldn't you at least leave a few millimeters? Why did you cut everything to 0? Now all my wrinkles and folds are visible. I look like I'm about to die." Tricia swallowed but decided not to show fear. "It's unhygienic," she said sternly, "and it looks better on you. Trust me as a woman." The old man chuckled. "Have you ever had a man, woman? You look like an old maid." Tricia flared up. She had arrived here in a simple dress without makeup and her hair in a ponytail. "Don't worry," she said dryly. "I have 3 children." Mr. Arnold whistled. "And with different men?" he said snidely. "From one." "Well, he's an interesting type. He has 3 children and sent his woman to work." Tricia pressed her lips together. "We broke up." "Why? Did you piss him off, so he ran away?" "That's none of your business," Tricia answered, sharper than she intended. "What's next on the plan?" "Take the tablet from the table," the old man grumbled. "There should be left a detailed schedule." Tricia found the tablet at the indicated place. She looked over it. Indeed, there was a lot to do. It seemed that Mr. Arnold was seriously ill, judging by the number of pills and injections he required daily. "Have you had lunch yet?" the woman asked. "No, I was waiting for you." "Of course I've had lunch." "I see." Tricia decided not to respond to his rudeness. "Then you can take a rest and Then you take a rest and I'll make an IV now." "You're a genius, I see." She clenched the tablet, her fingers turning white, but said nothing. "Should we start the drip with you lying down?" Tricia, gathering her courage, once asked Nick if their boss had a wife and children. "As far as I know," he replied, "no children. But he had 4 wives." 4? Tricia gasped. "Yes, he married his first wife when he was quite young. I think she was from a wealthy family, and he was either working for her father or they were in business together, I'm not sure. It was a marriage of convenience, and in the end they divorced. Then he married a model who was 10 or 15 years younger. They were together for 3 or 4 years, but he caught her cheating and divorced her as well. The third wife left him. She was a young and pretty girl, and she quickly got bored with him. Wow, Tricia sighed. And the fourth? The fourth was an old friend of his. They were the same age and had known each other for a long time. They married when they were both over 50. They seemed to have a good life together, but she died about 5 years ago of cancer. That's sad, Tricia commented. Yes, those who have been working here longer than me say that's when he changed. He was supposedly quite bearable before. Not an angel, of course, but one could live with him. Now he's becoming more difficult each day. That's sorrowful. Does he have any relatives? Nick shrugged. He has a sister who has her own children and grandchildren, but they live abroad and rarely visit. He's a very lonely man, said Tricia. It's sad to be so sick and to live alone in a huge house. True, replied Nick. He takes his frustrations out on those around him. Every evening, Tricia looked forward to the end of the workday when she could finally spend time with her children. They had settled in quite well. All the staff on the estate were friendly towards Zach, Brandon, and especially little Alicia. Sarah treated them with treats. Frank would take them for rides, with Tricia's permission, when he had errands for the boss. They loved exploring the estate with its massive garden and many beautiful quiet corners. They only made sure to avoid the master of the house, which was not difficult. Mr. Arnold only went for walks with Tricia, usually in the morning and occasionally in the afternoon or late evening. After 2 weeks, Tricia was reminded for the first time of her irregular working hours. She and the children had long been asleep when her phone suddenly rang. It was Nick. Tricia, rush to the house immediately. Mr. Arnold is having a seizure. Instantly awake, Tricia remembered she had been warned that her patient could have such attacks. Without bothering to dress, she threw on a robe and rushed into the house. She quickly entered the bedroom. Mr. Arnold was half lying on the bed and breathing so hard that she heard his whistles and wheezes from afar. Next to him was Nick, who had already opened the windows and was gathering the medical supplies. Nodding in gratitude, she began to work. She placed an oxygen mask over Mr. Arnold's face and started the oxygen supply. She then found the necessary medication and administered it. Thankfully, the attack wasn't severe, and the drugs took effect quickly. "How are you, Mr. Arnold?" she asked, once his pulse and breathing had stabilized. The old man wheezed. "For the man who nearly died, I'm well." "You need some hot tea," Tricia suggested. "I'll have it made right away." "Good," he replied. "Also, I have one more favour to ask. Will you do it?" Tricia nodded. "Yes, of course. What is it?" "Hurry up next time, or you'll be too late." Tricia felt her sympathy for the old man evaporate. "I'll try," she replied coolly. "I'll go and arrange for the tea." After she had asked for the tea to be made, Nick came into the kitchen. "How are you?" he asked. "Fine." "That's just the way he is. He'll play the scumbag till the end, even when he's dead." "Play?" Tricia asked. "That's the way he is in my mind." The manager sighed and ran his hand through his hair. "You know," he said in a confidential tone, "I sometimes think the boss isn't really like that. He just decided at some point that this was the only way to communicate with the world, and he's now afraid to act human." Tricia shrugged her shoulders. "A noble version, Nick, but I'm sorry. I believe he's being sincere." Nick smiled. "Would you like some coffee?" he suggested. "No, I'd rather go to bed. Good night." "Good night, Tricia." The next day, when Tricia and the children came for breakfast, Nick made an unexpected announcement. "Tricia, you have the day off today." "Why is that?" she wondered. The manager shrugged. The chief said so. His sister's visiting him with the kids. I guess they'll look after him. Tricia frowned. And the injections? The drip? Nick waved his hand. Don't worry, we call a nurse from a private clinic. And why doesn't she come every day? Why do you need me? The boss doesn't like new people, Sarah suddenly chimed in with a smile, who was serving cheesecakes to the children. That's why he insists on having someone permanent, someone who knows all of his habits. I see, Tricia replied. She added mentally, so he drives people crazy and makes them quit. A permanent slave is more pleasant to abuse than nurses from a private clinic who will be different every time. She didn't say it in front of the children because she wanted them to believe she had a good job. We've almost all been given the day off, Frank chimed in. If you don't mind, Tricia, and you guys too, I can take the kids to the zoo, and we can stop for lunch somewhere on the way. Hooray! Alicia cried joyfully. Of all three, she was the closest to the young, cheerful driver, who always paid attention to the children. No, my dears, Tricia said firmly. Frank has the day off and I can't impose on him. But the driver dismissed her concerns. Don't worry, Tricia, he said. I'm going to the zoo with my nephew, who's 10. I can take your kids too. It's not a problem for me. Tricia looked at the children with doubt. We'll behave, Brandon pleaded with his mother. Zack shrugged his shoulders, saying, I'll go if I have to. All right, she sighed. Then I'll go get the money. You don't have to, Frank replied. The boss always leaves us money for small expenses. Don't even worry about it, Sarah assured her. After breakfast, Frank and the children went to the garage to start the car. Only Nick and Tricia remained in the kitchen. Do you have plans for the weekend? Nick asked Tricia. I'm not sure. I guess I should go to the city and check on the apartment. Nick perked up. Do you want to go together? I've got a couple of the boss's errands to run. It won't take long, and then we can check your apartment. We could have lunch on the way back, if you don't mind. Yes, we can, Tricia replied. With Nick, she felt at ease and comfortable. He knew how to keep a conversation going without being intrusive. He spoke interestingly about his current affairs without revealing too much. Tricia realized how much she had been missing simple human interaction. After she resigned from her job, her life revolved around her husband and children. She had friends from college and work, but they had their own lives, husbands, children, work, and couldn't meet too often. After Hector's leaving, she retreated into her troubles. Worrying about job prospects, mortgage payments, and her children's feelings consumed her. She had no time for herself. How long have you been working for Mr. Arnold? She asked Nick. Nick thought for a few seconds, then replied, 5 years. That's a long time, she exclaimed. Well, except for you, I'm probably the newest in the house. Amazing. How do you all manage to stay? Has he always been like this? Nick laughed. When I started, he was perhaps a little gentler, but he wasn't particularly kind. I can't deny that I've had my difficulties with him. I can imagine, Tricia sighed. For the first 6 months, I wanted to quit about 7 times a day. Eventually, it became less frequent. Now, I don't think about it at all, Nick confessed. Tricia frowned. Why? Is it the salary? It plays a part, yes, but it's not the only reason. What else, then? Tricia was curious. Nick seemed so smart and confident. Unlike her, he could probably find many great jobs elsewhere. Experience, Nick replied. I not only manage the house, but also help Mr. Arnold to conduct business remotely. Although he looks so weak and decrepit, his brain is still sharp, and I'm doubtful I could find another job that would let me learn how to manage such large capital. I see, said Tricia, but your life seems to revolve around Mr. Arnold. Don't you find that a pity? I assume your wife and children hardly see you at home. Nick laughed. Of course I don't look very young, he said, but I'm only 33. Tricia was embarrassed. "I don't know what you mean," she admitted. "And you look wonderful." "Thank you. I'm flattered. It's not every day I get compliments from such beautiful women. I meant I don't have a wife and children yet." "Fiancé?" "No." "Girlfriend?" "No. Does that look suspicious?" Tricia laughed. "A little," she admitted. "I'm just a workaholic. I want to start a family when I'm sure I can provide for them. By the way, we're here. Can you wait? It's just 15 minutes, then we'll drive to your apartment." "Sure," Tricia replied. Nick grabbed some folder with documents and left. Tricia was left alone in the car. She thought that perhaps, like Nick, she might find herself tied to this house and the mean old man for years to come. It's summer now, but what about in the fall, when the kids go to school? She suddenly realized that Mary Austin, who had hired her, hadn't discussed this issue with her. Likely because she hadn't expected Tricia to stay for so long. But Tricia is holding on, and she's not going to quit. "No, you, Mr. Arnold, won't get it." She bit her lip painfully, remembering last night. She had been truly afraid for him then, and for the first time had felt sorry for him. But he, as soon as he could breathe, immediately insulted her. Nick came back and interrupted her sad thoughts. He looked pleased. "Let's go to your place?" "Let's go." It was unlikely, as if anything could happen there, but Tricia was still more used to being in control. "Now for lunch," said Nick cheerfully. "I'll show you a wonderful place." "I don't think they cook there as well as our Sarah does," laughed Tricia. "Oh, yes," Nick sighed, "but I'll still try to surprise you." He took her to a large French restaurant situated on the top floor of a high business centre. The pleasant music playing and the air conditioners operating at full blast were a welcome respite from the hot summer day. They were led to a table with 2 comfy sofas by the window, offering a view of the river and the bridge. "Would you mind if I chose for you?" Nick asked. "Go ahead," Tricia cheerfully responded. "I am not familiar with everything here anyway." "Fine," Nick replied. When the waiter came up, Nick pointed his finger at several items on the menu without showing Tricia. So she didn't know what to expect and was very surprised when the first thing they bought her was a glass of red wine. "It's only lunchtime, isn't it?" she reminded her companion. "So?" Tricia sighed, unable to find any other argument. "And you won't have any?" "I'm driving." "Right." The wine was a balanced mix of moderate sweetness and tartness. Tricia savoured the taste, realising that she couldn't recall the last time she had simply sat and spent time leisurely with a glass of wine. "Thank you," she said. "This is the most wonderful day of last year." Nick smiled. "Wait to thank me," he said. "The meal hasn't arrived yet." "Tell me about yourself," Tricia requested suddenly. "You're quite the mystery to me." The man's eyebrows rose in amusement. "Now that's a confession. Why am I a mystery?" "It's just that I know nothing about you," she admitted. "Neither do I about you," Nick retorted. "Fair enough, but let's start with you." Nick hummed in agreement. "Well, let's. I'm not from around here, born in a small township far away from here. I attended an ordinary settlement school, grew up in an ordinary family. But I always had big ambitions. That's why I decided to come here. It wasn't easy, but I managed. My student years were fun, then I got a job, then I changed 5 more jobs until I got to Mr. Arnold. And the rest you know." "There's a feeling that you skipped a lot in your story," Tricia remarked thoughtfully. "Who knows? Maybe I'll tell you about it later. Now we are going to talk about you," he urged. "Okay, well, I don't have anything interesting either. I'm from here, but I was raised by my mum. I never knew my father, and my mum didn't tell me much about him. She was a music teacher, so we lived modestly," she confessed. Did you go to music school? Tricia sighed. Oh, yes, 2 long years of my life. I only remember one tune now. My mother made me play it most often. Everything else faded from my memory. I've played it so many times that if you woke me up at 2 a.m., I'd play it with my eyes closed. What's the tune? Bach? Chopin? Tchaikovsky? No, it's not classical, that's for sure. Honestly, I don't even know. My mum never told me who wrote it. I have a theory that she composed it herself, but I can't confirm it, she shared. Do any of your children go to music school? No, Tricia responded curtly. Unlike you, I didn't study very well, Tricia continued. For some reason, I suddenly decided that I wanted to be a nurse. I thought it was a beautiful, noble, and romantic profession. It is, said Nick. Not a bit, sighed Tricia. No, I don't regret it. I found studying interesting and working as well, especially at work where I met Hector, my husband. He was your patient? Yes, I had just started working and I didn't know how to do anything myself. I remember even my hands were shaking when I was giving injections or dressings. I thought it was obvious, but Hector didn't notice. Nick smiled. I'm sure he fell in love with you at first sight. He said he did. In fact, I liked him too. We started dating soon after, and 6 months later we were married. Shortly after, I found out I was pregnant. You've become a very young mum, Nick smiled. Yes, the first time was difficult, but then my mum was still alive. She helped me a lot. Tricia sighed. Then Zach grew up, went to kindergarten, and I went back to work. However, when he turned 4, I got pregnant with Brandon, and 3 years later, Alicia was born. After Alicia was born, we decided I'd stay at home, so I didn't work for 7 years. Wow, said Nick. I must say you're doing a great job, especially after such a break. Tricia smiled. Thank you, that's nice to hear. Can I ask you a personal question? Nick asked. Tricia took another sip of wine. Why did I split up with my husband? Yes. He left me, Tricia confessed, possibly influenced by the wine. He just left a note saying he was in love with another woman. He didn't even talk to you? Tricia shook her head. What about the children? He didn't even say goodbye to them either. How awful! And child support? Tricia smiled sadly. It's all right. I'm fine now. That's why you're hanging on to this job. Exactly. They fell silent for a few minutes, contemplating the conversation they just had. Then Tricia asked, What about your love life? You're only 2 years younger than me. I can't believe you haven't had a serious relationship. Nick smiled sadly. I have, and quite a long one. When I was still at college, I dated an ambitious girl. We both had ambition, but our goals were different. My ambition was career-focused, while hers was to find a successful man. Aren't you a successful man? Asked Tricia in surprise. Well, thank you for such a compliment. It's hard for me to assess myself. Then I say you are a successful man, interrupted Tricia. Much obliged, replied Nick with a smile. Well, regardless, my girlfriend at the time did not see me as a successful man. She broke up with me, saying she deserved better. A very foolish woman, Tricia commented. After that remark, I need to get you more wine, said Nick, signalling the waiter. So she left me and I decided to become a successful man so she would come back to me. And how was that going? Great! Along the way I realized that I don't want to be with a woman who doesn't value me for who I am, but for my social status. Tricia nodded. And I don't want to be with a man who left, leaving only a note on the table, she said. Nick smiled sadly. I fully support such a wise decision. In the morning, Tricia awoke with difficulty. Her head was throbbing, her mouth was dry, and the sunlight streaming through the curtains seemed unbearably bright. I've overslept. I probably didn't even set my alarm clock last night. but the clock indicated that it was still early. Tricia showered and brushed her teeth. Ensuring that the children were still asleep, she quietly went to the main house. Sarah was already bustling about in the kitchen. "Oh, Tricia," the woman greeted her cheerfully. "Good morning. You're up early today?" "Yes," Tricia replied hoarsely. "I seem to have had a wild day off yesterday." Sarah smiled understandingly. "You'll be fine. In an hour you'll be as cheerful as a 15-year-old schoolgirl." Soon she placed a large cup of fragrant tea, redolent with berries and herbs, before Tricia. "The best cure for a hangover," Sarah declared confidently. "And eat this." She placed a plate with a large sandwich with meat, lettuce, tomatoes and eggs in front of Tricia. "This is the most delicious thing I've ever eaten in my life," Tricia said blissfully as she ate her breakfast. "You're magic." "Thank you," Sarah replied, embarrassed. By the start of the workday, Tricia had recovered significantly, and Mr. Arnold was unusually amicable today. Perhaps his meeting with his relatives had influenced him, but he barely critiqued Tricia's actions and refrained from derogatory remarks. "You're surprisingly quiet today," Tricia commented during their traditional afternoon walk after lunch. "It's not evening yet," Mr. Arnold responded, but without malice. "Those are your children, right?" He pointed to Brandon and Alicia, who were chasing each other around the fountain. Zach was sitting on a bench reading a book with one eye and keeping an eye on the younger ones with the other. "Yes, mine," answered Tricia, fearing a reprimand. But Mr. Arnold simply nodded. "They're good kids, and they seem friendly." "Thank you," Tricia replied cautiously. "Are you raising them alone?" The boss continued his unexpected interest. "I'm alone now," she replied. "That's why you put up with me," he said, not as a question but as a statement. Tricia didn't respond. "I too wanted to have many children when I was young," Mr. Arnold suddenly disclosed, "but it didn't work out." "You've been married 4 times, haven't you?" Tricia asked in surprise, then regretted her words. She wasn't supposed to know such information, but surprisingly the chief didn't comment on it. Mr. Arnold seemed to gaze into the distance, as if mentally reviewing his entire life. "My first wife didn't want children, and at the time neither did I. We were young and spoiled, both from rich families. We wanted to have fun and enjoy life. Or rather, my wife did. I was more interested in building a business." "So why did you get married?" Tricia asked. "The parents insisted. It was beneficial for the common cause. I wasn't against it, she was a pretty girl, and I thought we'd be fine. But after a few years it became clear that we were entirely different people. I got divorced and went to work." He paused. "Could I have some water, please?" Mr. Arnold suddenly asked. Tricia quickly handed over the bottle. Mr. Arnold took a sip and continued. "I have almost nothing to say about my second and third wives. I married them for status. They were young and beautiful. I thought it would be great, but each time I quickly realized it wasn't what I wanted. All they wanted from me was money." He paused again. Tricia offered more water, but the man shook his head. "There was a time when I could have experienced true love." "Your 4th wife?" "No, that was before her. I didn't marry that girl. I've regretted it many times since, but I don't want to talk about it. It's too personal." "So everything else isn't too personal?" Tricia thought, puzzled as to why he chose to share all this with her. "My 4th wife has become more of a friend," said Mr. Arnold. "I already knew about her diagnosis when I proposed marriage." "Diagnosis?" Tricia asked. "Yes, she had cancer. We had known each other for years. Our parents had been friends since childhood. Over the years we kept in touch intermittently. Then we met, talked, and decided to spend a few years together." "Were you with her until the end?" Tricia asked. Mr. Arnold nodded. "She was a wonderful woman and a true friend. After she died, I didn't want anyone else." "I sympathize with you," Tricia said sincerely. After her words, Mr. Arnold seemed to snap back to reality. "We're talking too much," he said. "Let's go home. It's time for my evening pills." Following this peculiar conversation, Tricia again felt pity for her boss. Their communication didn't improve significantly, yet she found his harsh words easier to bear. As summer was ending, Tricia began to consider the approaching school year. "How do you like it here?" she asked her children. "I like it very much," Alicia answered first. "Anya cooks deliciously. Frank takes us everywhere. There's a big garden and we can play all day long." "You'll be going back to school soon," Tricia reminded her. Her daughter made a funny face. "I don't want to go to school," she said. Tricia sighed and looked at her middle child. "I like living here too," Brandon said, "but I understand that we have to return to school in the city." Brandon sighed. Then Tricia looked at her eldest son. "I think we need to talk," Zach said and led his mum to the yard. "Summer is ending. We'll all have to go back to school soon and consider our accommodation situation." Tricia smiled, saying, "You're as rational and serious as ever." Their son nodded, confessing, "Daddy called me the other day." Tricia's eyes widened in surprise. "Why didn't he call me?" "I guess he's afraid, but the official reason is that he's very busy." "I see," Tricia sighed. "What did he want?" "As far as I can understand, he wants to meet with you, perhaps to discuss the divorce, or maybe he wants to reconcile." Tricia laughed, exclaiming, "Reconciliation? Well, maybe." Tricia hesitated before asking her son, "Do you want that to happen?" Zach shook his head, saying, "I don't mind if Brandon and Brenda see him, if they'd like to. I'll see him too if necessary, but the rest is for you to decide." "He is your father," she reminded, "but I don't think I love him anymore, and I can't forgive what he did." "You don't have to forgive him. Regarding our school, why don't you talk to Nick? He might come up with something." "I'll try. You're the smartest, as always." Tricia hugged her son. "Everything will be all right, Mum," he assured. "Tell your father I'm ready to talk to him. Let him call me." "I'll tell him," promised Zach. A few days later, after Tricia and Mr. Arnold had completed their morning routines, Nick came into the room. "Ready, Mr. Arnold?" asked the assistant. "Absolutely, let's go. You're coming with us too," replied the boss, addressing Tricia. "Me?" She looked surprised. "Sure," Mr. Arnold replied calmly. "I have a lot of paperwork to sign and several face-to-face meetings to attend. I may need you at any time. What if I have a seizure? I don't want to suffocate in front of my business partners." As they drove to the business centre, Nick said, "We're not sure how long it will take, so you can wait for us in the restaurant. It's in the same building on the top floor. Just ask them to bill everything to Mr. Arnold." "Okay," Tricia replied. "If I need anything, Nick will call," Mr. Arnold added. At the restaurant, Tricia ordered tea and tiramisu. She suddenly thought that this would be the perfect opportunity to meet her husband. He seemed to be in town, and they had pressing matters to discuss. She called him and he agreed to come over. "What a nice place you picked," he said as he sat down at the table. Hector had not changed much, except for losing some weight. "You look wonderful," he complimented. "Thank you," Tricia replied. "You too." He shrugged shyly. "I'm glad you called." Tricia sighed. "We should have talked a long time ago, at least to decide when to file for divorce." "That's precisely what I wanted to discuss," Hector said, and moving closer, he gently placed his hand on hers. "Perhaps we were hasty," he suggested. "Maybe we don't need a divorce." "We were hasty?" Tricia asked incredulously. "It was you who left me. Left a note and didn't even say goodbye to the children. You didn't answer calls or messages and just disappeared from our lives as if we meant nothing to you after 15 years of marriage."
Hector squirmed uncomfortably in his seat. "Forgive me," he said. "I don't know what came over me. It was like some kind of lapse of mind."
Tricia sighed and pulled her hand free. "I won't ask you how long you've been unfaithful or why you decided to leave. But why couldn't you talk to me properly? Why did you abandon the children?" Her husband lowered his eyes in shame.
"I don't know, Tricia," he confessed. "I think it's a midlife crisis. At some point everything just became too much. The work, the household chores, the 3 kids. You were always with them and I felt sidelined. I was tired of this damn life full of duties."
"Is your new love young, fun, carefree, childless?" Tricia asked.
"Sort of. I lost my head back then. I didn't have the courage to tell you or the kids."
"What's different now?" she inquired.
Hector moved closer. "I've realized how much I've missed you and the kids," he confessed. "I want things to go back to how they were."
Tricia slowly shook her head. "Nothing has changed," she said. "We'll reunite and you'll run off with another girl in a few weeks."
"I won't do that,"
the man insisted. Tricia sighed. "Hector," she said, "I've had time to think. I can't forgive you, and my love for you has faded. I think we need to agree on a date to file for divorce." His face changed, and Tricia watched the facade of tenderness and remorse disappear.
"Then we need to discuss property division," he said.
Tricia was taken aback, but agreed. "Your car is yours, mine is mine, and the apartment is for me and the kids." Hector disagreed. "No, let's sell it and split the money equally," he said sternly. "Equally? When I'm raising 3 children alone?" Tricia retorted. The husband was embarrassed but continued to stand his ground. "I had been paying the mortgage for it, and you didn't work. You sat on my neck." "Oh, really? But I was taking care of the house and the 3 kids, and now I'm paying the mortgage. You left me out of the blue and didn't even help the kids. You can't imagine what I've been through these past few months." "Then let's get back together, and we won't have to split the apartment," the man pleaded. Tricia sighed. "No, Hector. I've already said my piece." "That's how you talk." The husband's voice lowered to a snake-like hiss. "Who's going to want you, alone with 3 kids? Do you think any man but me will look at you? You're just a stupid domestic chicken. All you can do is cook soup." Tears flowed from Tricia's eyes. It hurt to hear such words from the father of her children, the man she had loved for many years. "Go on, play hard to get," her husband continued. "You yourself will come to me on your knees." "She won't," a familiar male voice sounded behind Tricia. Before she could see what happened next, Hector suddenly flew across almost the whole restaurant and collapsed on the floor, and Nick rubbed his hand that had just collided with Hector's jaw. "It was tough, but perhaps instructive," Mr. Arnold commented. Tricia looked around and saw her boss. He looked as pleased as a cat for some reason. "And you are here?" she said in amazement. "Did you hear everything?" "I heard enough," he said dryly. Hector got up from the floor, pressing his palm to his bloody face. "We'll talk to you again," he said to Tricia. "Wow," Mr. Arnold said admiringly. "I should get out of the estate more often. It turns out it's fun here." "Shall we go home?" Nick asked Tricia. "Let's go," Tricia replied quietly, wiping away her tears. At home, he was sent to the kitchen to drink tea and calm down. "We have something to discuss with the boss," said Nick. "And you just relax for a while. I'll call you." But Tricia couldn't relax. She kept replaying what had happened in the restaurant. "Probably they will dismiss me. I doubt Mr. Arnold
needs a troubled caregiver who gets his assistant into fights in the middle of the business centre. And what about the apartment? Do we still have to split it in half? Where will I and the kids live then? What if I have to find a new job? Even if I don't get fired today, the school issue is still on the table. The woman's head was filled with so many problems. Tricia, let's go. She lifted her head. The expression on Nick's face didn't reveal what was in store for her, so she rose and obediently followed him into the chief's office. What a spectacle you've given us today, Mr. Arnold cheerfully commented. I am sorry, said Tricia. I didn't anticipate things turning out this way. That's okay. It was even amusing, said her boss. Well, we have other matters to address now. Tricia squeezed with fear. Do you wish to continue working here? Mr. Arnold inquired. Aren't you going to lay me off? Tricia asked, surprised. Do you want to be fired? No, she answered hastily. Then I won't fire you. Okay. Tricia was taken aback. Your children will soon start school, so I'll provide a car and driver to transport them to and from school. Tricia was stunned. But why? She asked. Because I don't want to find a new caregiver, the boss replied calmly. Thank you, Tricia muttered. We also need to address your living arrangements, Nick added. What about them? Tricia asked, confused. Living in that house during the winter is one option, Mr. Arnold explained. It's warm and all, but it's not very convenient to run to and fro in the frost. Let's take a look at your new rooms. New rooms? There's a wing of the house that's practically empty, explained Nick. That's where we plan to put you. They left the study and moved towards rooms Tricia had never visited before. Why is this wing empty? Tricia asked with curiosity. Mr. Arnold sighed. It's part of my past, he said. I wanted to forget it and not remember it, but now I realize it's time to leave the past behind. They entered the largest room. This is the common room, the boss said. There's access to 4 bedrooms from here, just enough for you. Tricia walked around in surprise, taking in the rooms. Each room was like a separate work of art. The furniture was beautiful, tastefully selected, and pictures adorned the walls. Everything was thought out, down to the smallest detail. However, it was clear that no one had used it for many years. I wonder why, thought Tricia. More mysteries. Suddenly, she noticed the outline of a familiar object under a white cloth. A piano! Tricia exclaimed in amazement. May I? She turned to Mr. Arnold, who shrugged his shoulders. Tricia carefully removed the white cloth that covered the instrument and ran her finger over the keys. The instrument was slightly out of tune, but certainly playable. The woman sat down and began to play the only melody she remembered, one her mother had played for her countless times since she was a child. The first few notes were difficult, but her hands soon recalled the tune, and her fingers danced effortlessly across the keys. She sat with her back to Mr. Arnold, unaware of the changes in the elderly man's expression. At first, his face stretched in astonishment. Then he turned his head, as if to confirm his ears weren't deceiving him. Soon, tears began to roll down his cheeks. Nick looked at his chief and could not hold back a surprised exclamation. Mr. Arnold, what's wrong with you? Tricia quickly stopped and turned, amazed, to her charge. Unashamedly, the elderly man was sobbing, wiping his face with his shirt sleeve. How do you know that tune? He asked. It was written just for me. Once Tricia and Nick had calmed Mr. Arnold, they returned to his study, where he began his story. When I met Megan, he started, I was still married to my second wife. We stopped living together for that moment, only meeting to discuss property division. I was exhausted of all this. Work, the divorce. One day after a business meeting, I let my driver leave and went to the park. I sat on a bench and realised how pleasant it was. Just sunshine, bird songs, greening trees. And then I saw Megan. Tricia was stunned, her heart pounding. She could hardly believe what was happening. She was so beautiful, Mr. Arnold said dreamily. I have never seen a woman so beautiful. And when she smiled at me, I knew I was done for. Tricia noticed Nick looking at her, but he seemed embarrassed when she caught his eye and turned his attention back to the boss. However, Mr. Arnold seemed oblivious to his surroundings, lost in memories from over 35 years ago. My feet led me to her, he continued, and for the first time in my life, I was scared. I was terrified she would refuse to know me. I've known many women, but none have struck such awe in me upon first sight. To my delight, she agreed. He smiled blissfully. I don't think I've ever been so happy. My wife and I were already separated, so I brought Megan to this house and built this wing just for her. It's the sunniest side of the house, and the piano— Did she play for you? Tricia interrupted. Yes, Megan taught music, and that tune you played, she composed especially for me. Why did you two break up? Tricia asked. A tear rolled down Mr. Arnold's face again. I was a fool, he said calmly. I wanted to marry Megan, and she refused me. She said that she and I were from different worlds, that she didn't want to become just a rich businessman's wife and stay at home. I tried to persuade her, told her she could do whatever she wanted and be herself. But she refused and ended our relationship. Then why do you say it was your fault? Tricia asked. Mr. Arnold sighed. Because I didn't insist on my own way. Because I gave in easily. Because I didn't find out then that she was pregnant. Tricia looked up at him. Mr. Arnold was staring right back at her. Yes, he said calmly. I'm sure you're my daughter. Tricia blissfully stretched out her legs and lifted her head, enjoying the sun. She liked it here. The sea always had a positive effect on her, especially now they were starting vacationing as a family every year. Mum, did you see that? I swam faster than Brandon. Alicia ran up and exclaimed. Not faster, don't lie, the middle son shouted. He was clearly tired and out of breath, but didn't want to admit defeat to his younger sister, who had been going to swim lessons for 3 years and showing great results there. I just let you win, Brandon stated. Sure you did, Alicia retorted. She knew her capabilities and understood her brother was swimming with all his might. Brandon ran off resentfully towards the beach house. Honey, did you have to tease him? Tricia gently reprimanded her daughter. Okay, go take a shower. We'll go to dinner soon. After her daughter had run off, Tricia stretched, reluctantly got up from the sunbed and walked toward the house. She saw Zach lying in the hammock, as usual, talking on the phone. Again with his girl chattering, Tricia thought. He's all grown up now. Dinner in half an hour, she informed him. He nodded in response, indicating that he heard his mother's words. The spacious house was cool. Mr. Arnold and Nick were, as usual, seated in the living room playing chess. We'll be going home in 3 days, and you haven't even gotten a tan, Tricia sighed. She playfully ruffled her husband's hair and gave her father a kiss on the cheek. Don't worry, Tricia, her father reassured her. We'll make it. How's the sea? Nick inquired. Warm, Tricia responded. How's the game? It's a draw, the father sighed. Nick is not only adopting my business acumen, but also my chess-playing skills. Nick grinned. I learn from the best, Mr. Arnold, he answered. By the way, checkmate. Oh, you? Mr. Arnold swore. Suddenly, Alicia appeared. Grandpa, what did you say? Feigning severity, Mr. Arnold coughed in embarrassment. Young lady, that's a phrase you're legally not allowed to say for another 8 years. Alicia laughed. We have worse swear words at our school. And then she dashed off to the shower. We need to change schools, Mr. Arnold stated decisively. I won't have my only granddaughter learning such language. Then we may have to change grandfather too, Tricia said, laughing, because Alicia hears such words most often from you. A fair point, her father conceded, sighing. I'll try to swear less often. Tricia smiled, looking back towards the sea. Through the transparent, panoramic wall of their cottage, she could see the large, red sun approaching the horizon. I feel so good, she commented, as Nick came over and wrapped his arms around her from behind. I always feel good with you, her husband replied. Me too, Tricia agreed, and I'm perfectly happy. The final week of November was refreshingly crisp and frosty. The air started to carry the scent of an impending winter, the New Year's marvels, and lengthy holiday breaks. A lone car slowly traversed the road at a leisurely pace. It was a Sunday morning, and the highway was clear, allowing for uninterrupted driving without fear of traffic jams. Timothy relished this, a tranquil drive amidst silence and snow. What could surpass this? The heavy malachite green arms of the spruce trees contrasting with the white snow blankets. Suddenly, in the midst of all that white and green, he saw something orange covered with snow. Without knowing why, the man hit the brakes and went to take a closer look at the strange find. Child, what happened to you? He yelled, dropping to his knees to dust the snow off the child's overalls. What are you doing here? The girl didn't respond. She was about 5 or 6 years old, with round rosy cheeks and mittens covered in snow clumps. He bent lower, attempting to hear her breath. Her long eyelashes fluttered. She's alive. It's hot here, the little girl mumbled incoherently, attempting to unzip her overalls. Mummy, I'm hot. Need water. Just a moment, the man whispered, scooping up some snow with his hand and bringing it to the girl's lips. She licked the snow and immediately opened her large grey eyes. It's snow. You bet it is, Timothy grinned crookedly. And where's your mum? Mum? The girl furrowed her blonde eyebrows amusingly, trying to remember. Do you live around here? Please show me your house. She shook her head. He only now noticed that her knitted cap was wet from the snow. We took the bus, she said. Mum's probably home. Daddy and I walked here. And where is he? The girl looked around, confused. I don't know. Daddy said we were going to play hide-and-seek. He hid, and I had to look for him. I've been looking and looking, but he's nowhere to be found. I'm tired. I see, said Timothy. So let's do it this way. I'll take you to my house. You can warm up and drink some hot tea, and then we'll look for your mum. Let me carry you. He picked the little girl up easily and walked to the car. Just don't sleep, okay? We'll turn on the heater. What's your name? My name is Timothy. Avery, the little girl said. 20 minutes later, upon entering his apartment, Timothy wrinkled his nose, greeted by the familiar silence and the stifling smell of medicine. This persistent odour pervaded everything, a constant reminder of his mother's illness. It smells like a hospital, Avery remarked, wrinkling her little snub nose. Timothy set the girl on the floor and began unlacing her shoes. My mother is ill, he explained. She is being cared for by a nurse. She gives her injections and medications. Are you hungry? I think we have pancakes. Do you like pancakes? Are they with jam? Avery asked, her eyes lighting up. with jam and honey and anything you want. But promise me, Timothy said sternly, that you'll wash them down with some hot tea, okay?
Deal,
the girl agreed, shaking her wet mittens.
Where can I dry them?
We'll find a place. Timothy smiled, taking her hand. Let's go to the kitchen, shall we? Timothy was right. The pancakes were still there, warm and ready to be devoured. Avery sat on a high stool, hungrily eating her treat and sipping her tea. Timothy left for a moment, returning shortly with a pair of warm woolen socks. I don't have your size, you know, he said, pulling the socks over the child's cold feet. But these will do. The main thing is that they're warm. The girl paused with the pancake halfway to her mouth and looked at him with a childlike intensity. Don't you have any children? She asked in surprise. No, Timothy admitted, but I will have them someday. The girl fidgeted restlessly in the chair. Dad says he who has no children is a lucky man, she said, staring straight ahead. He says children are only trouble and loss, especially girls. Oh, your dad talks nonsense, Timothy said angrily, then added more calmly, well, I mean, your dad probably didn't mean it. He was likely just angry or exhausted at the time, so he said it without thinking. No, he says that every day, the girl said glumly, and Mummy cries and cries. Timothy was finally confused. It seemed that this little girl's family was the kind that even the enemy would not wish. What should I do now? Of course, I must find the girl's parents, but how can I give her back? She'll have to listen to her father's nonsense again. Let me pour you some tea, he said, awkwardly changing the subject. You aren't probably warm yet. Oh, there's Valerie. He looked at the nurse who had entered the kitchen. Hi, Valerie said tiredly. Her eyes were reddened. Clearly she had been up all night, due to Timothy's mother's insomnia. The poor nurse had spent the night reading aloud Dumas's novels. I heard your voice. I came to see who you were talking to. I thought it was the doctor again, but I was wrong. Who's this girl? She looked at the little guest, who was engrossed in dipping pancakes in jam, and seemed oblivious to her surroundings. Timothy had already realized that the little girl was not at all afraid of strangers. Meet Avery, Timothy smiled. She will be staying with us for the time being. Is she your friend's daughter? Valerie asked. Well, he hesitated. Almost. How's Mum? The nurse sighed. I have no good news, Timothy. She hasn't slept all night again. We read and talk, but sleep eludes her. Her blood pressure is high and difficult to bring down. Well, you know how it is. Yeah, I know, the man said darkly. Listen, Valerie, I have to leave now. I have an appointment. But it shouldn't take long. Could you take care of our little guest? Give her a warm bath and then put her to sleep. She's been playing in the snow and is exhausted. Oh, of course. I'll look after her. Plus, your mother finally fell asleep, so don't worry. Avery? Do you like to have a bath? Valerie asked, and the little girl nodded cheerfully, her face smeared with cherry jam. Timothy stepped out of the house, inhaling the fresh air, devoid of the constant medicinal scent. It felt good. He'd been growing uncomfortable at home, primarily due to his ailing mother. It was painful for him to watch, day by day, as a close person gradually passes away from this life, and he looked at it and couldn't do anything to help. Timothy had been caring for his mother for a year since they moved in together. He hired a professional nurse, paid for the best doctors, and catered to his mother's every whim. However, all of these efforts felt futile. He consoled himself with the thought that his mother's transition from one world to another would be as comfortable as possible. Timothy was so deep in thought that he didn't realize his phone had been vibrating in his pocket for a while. Hello? It was Timothy's mother's doctor on the line, who was scheduled to visit her that afternoon. Timothy, good day. Can we talk? Yeah, is something wrong? Timothy said, settling behind the wheel. Checking his watch, he realized he had 10 minutes to spare. So, what do you want to discuss? Look, the doctor began hesitantly, I reviewed all the x-rays again today, in chronological order. You know, a fractured femoral neck is not easy, especially for someone under 40. But your mother was lucky. It healed perfectly. She should be walking. Then why isn't she walking? Timothy asked, getting tired of the long-winded explanations. You've seen it yourself. She hasn't gotten up in a year. I remember. It's a bit of a mystery, but I don't think it's physiological. Then what is it? The doctor paused. You might need a good psychotherapist, Timothy. It might be something psychological. She could be fearful of re-injury, or there might be secondary benefits. Secondary benefits? What do you mean? Well, she's living like a queen. Everyone is attentive to her. She has a nurse. She's well fed and pampered. Maybe she likes it. Maybe she's pretending to be sick. You mean she's faking it? I'm not saying that, but we can't rule it out. You'll need to find a psychologist. That's all I have to say. I will visit your mother tomorrow. See you. The phrase secondary benefits kept echoing in Timothy's mind. It was as if a hidden string deep within his soul had been struck, producing a grating sound that set his teeth on edge. He couldn't stop thinking about it during a business meeting with his partners, and even afterward, he didn't know how to shake it off. Secondary benefits. What if it's true? He couldn't recall a time when his mother had seemed genuinely happy. He had always felt a pang of sympathy for her, as though she were perpetually unfortunate. Her relationship with her father was tense. While they weren't poor, and his father was neither a drinker, abusive, nor unfaithful, something vital was missing from their relationship. Perhaps it was simple human kindness. His mother was a chronic complainer, perpetually dissatisfied with something. Her husband, her son, life in general. Worse yet, she never tried to restrain herself. At best, she would adopt a distant gaze and mumble under her breath. More often, she would yell and shame. In response, his father would retreat to the garage to work on the car, silently escaping the constant accusing without uttering a word. Occasionally he would retort, triggering a major argument that made home an unbearable place to be, and he left. Afterward, the woman would cry, lamenting her miserable life to her son, before dissolving into tears again. Timothy remembered how desperately he wanted to see his mother happy. He used to try to comfort her after each family dispute, and often made small child gifts for her. He was willing to give her everything, but it seemed as though she never noticed. She was perpetually saddened by the fact that her son was not an exceptional student. After parent-teacher conferences, she would return looking sorrowful and with a sigh of disappointing, "Nothing good, I'm very upset." As Timothy grew older and started resisting her increasing control, a new kind of struggle began. His teenage outbursts became a cause for suspicion of drug use and speculation about his future profession. His mother predicted that he would become a janitor. Initially, Timothy felt hurt, but he eventually became used to it, even learning to disregard it. Such is her character, he thought with a philosophical calmness. He began to perceive his mother's screams as mere white noise. However, an incident closer to his graduation broke his patience. Excuses about his mother's character lost all significance. The girl's name was Marissa. She studied in a parallel class. Unexpectedly, as is the case, love struck them both, despite the fact they had barely noticed each other before. Timothy recalled how he bumped into Marissa in the school corridor, froze in front of her, blushed, and struggled to say something, to greet her or just say anything. During the subsequent physics lesson, he tried to understand how he had previously overlooked her enormous, light-coloured eyes, which were as clear and serene as mountain lakes. Her eyelashes were long and as black as coal, and her braid was thick. He suddenly had a profound desire to see her blonde hair loose, imagining it to be as soft as silk and smelling of fresh grass, which had been his favourite scent since childhood. That day,
he received a D for failing to hear a teacher's question and was scolded for his inattentiveness. But he wasn't upset. None of it mattered from now on. After school, he waited for Marissa on the porch. When she exited and saw him, she smiled brightly, like a spring day. "I thought you had left already," she said. Timothy wished to respond with something clever and funny, but nothing came to mind. Instead, he just took her backpack and grumbled. "How can you carry such a heavy load? It's unhealthy. Come on, I'll walk you out," he said. Marissa smiled slyly. "I live nearby, over there." She pointed to the nearest house. "Well, then I'll walk you home, and then we'll go for a walk." He kept quiet about his first romantic feelings at home, but he made the mistake of keeping a personal diary where he detailed every encounter. Timothy and Marissa dreamt of sharing a life, but one day the girl vanished. Assuming she was sick, Timothy rushed to her home right after school. Her mother, stern-faced, opened the door. "Is Marissa home?" Timothy asked. The woman gave him a disdainful look. "No, and don't come here again. Marissa will be finishing her studies in another town." "Why? She didn't mention anything like that. She would have told me." "Your mother came to see us," said Marissa's mother sternly. "She said that because of Marissa, you've neglected your studies and started drinking beer too much." "It's not true," he exclaimed indignantly. "She claimed you were in bad company. I worry about my daughter. I don't want her associating with hooligans. So forget about her and don't come here again." "She lied to you and you believed it." Timothy began to justify himself, but the door had already slammed shut. He sat on the steps, burying his head in his arms. So his mother had read his diary and concocted lies to dissuade the girl from him. Timothy felt a deep sense of violation, as though he'd been trampled on without any apology. "Now, where shall I go?" he thought wearily. In the past he would have gone home, but he now realized painfully that he had no home. A home is a place where people trust each other, not engage in deceitful schemes behind each other's backs. But the tragedy was that he had nowhere else to turn. Hearing the key rattling in the lock, his mother appeared in the hallway. She took in her son's distraught expression and barely suppressed a smile. "I baked pies," she announced gently, "with potatoes and with meat. Your favourites." "Thank you," Timothy mumbled. "I'm not hungry." "I see," his mother responded, placing her hands on her hips. "A rebellion, is it?" Timothy quietly removed his shoes, hung his jacket in the closet, and then turned to face her. "Why, Mum?" he asked gently, but his voice was fraught with suppressed anger. "Why what? I don't know what you mean." "Why did you go through my things? Why did you lie to Marissa's mum? She sent her off to another town, and I'll never see her again," he accused with desperation in his voice. His mother's face was impenetrable. "I had nothing to do with it," she responded. "I don't know what you're talking about. Wash your hands and sit at the table." "Why do you lie to me, Mother?" he asked tiredly. "I've been told everything." "I've told you clearly I had nothing to do with it," the woman insisted. "I see," he said. "You had nothing to do with it. And anyway, it was all my dream. I get it." Timothy retired to his room and sat on the bed for a while, studying the patterns on the wallpaper with detached wonder. "It's strange. Just this morning, I was sure that everything around me, the walls, the table, the bloody wallpaper pattern, was home. But it's all a lie. Not a home, but a cage where I was deceived into staying. How awful!" The only consolation was that there were only 3 weeks left until graduation. After that, he could leave this place. He just had to wait a little longer. Timothy vividly remembered getting on the train, leaving his school friends on the platform. His mother hadn't come to the station. When she learned of his decision, she melodramatically clutched her heart, grabbed her blood pressure monitor and wept. When this didn't work, she tried her persuasion, which also failed. She then resorted to shouting and accusing Timothy of ingratitude. This could have continued indefinitely if his father hadn't intervened.
"Don't, Rachel," he said. "You've brought this on yourself. Let him go." "From home?" "Yes, or you'll ruin his life too." He looked at Timothy with understanding and sympathy in his eyes. "Thanks, Dad," Timothy said gratefully. His father simply patted him on the head in response. As the train started moving, Timothy sighed with relief. "I'm free. Now I can finally start my life." He didn't visit his parents often, perhaps once a year at most, and he never stayed overnight. His mother resented his infrequent visits, but his father understood. During Timothy's first visit, his father asked him to help clean the garage. Timothy readily agreed, but upon entering the garage, he found it impeccably organized. "Where's the mess you promised?" he asked cheerfully. Instead of answering, Dad pulled out several white envelopes from under the car seat. "From Marissa," he said, offering a letter to his son. "She wrote to you, as you see." "But why didn't you give them to me immediately?" Timothy replied, perplexed. His father's face turned red with embarrassment. "Your mother was intercepting them," he admitted reluctantly, "and I stole them from her. But don't be angry with her, son. Your mum's a difficult woman, but I'm certain she meant well. She just thought it was best for you." "But you don't agree with that," Timothy stated flatly, "or you wouldn't have given me the letters." His father ran his hands through the hair on the back of his neck, a habit he had when faced with a difficult conversation. "You're an adult now," he finally said, "but it's still hard for me to discuss this. Your mother and me, we perhaps rushed into marriage. It's not that either of us are bad or good. It's just that we are very different people, and maybe now that you're grown up, we can grant each other freedom and find happiness." "You want to leave Mum?" Timothy asked. His father looked down, embarrassed, and paused. Then, making up his mind, he looked Timothy in the eyes and said something he had been too ashamed to even admit to himself. "Yes, Timothy, I want to leave her. Do you disapprove?" His son knew how to appreciate honesty, and he only said, "No, Dad, it's your decision, and I'll accept it. You're adults too." At home, of course, he said nothing to his mother about the letters, but on the train, taking him back to his studies and his new friends, he read them all. Marissa's letters were painful to read, and Timothy wiped away his tears when he thought no one was looking. In the first letter, Marissa described her situation. They had taken her old phone with all the contacts and replaced it with a new one that only had 2 numbers, her mother's and her aunt's, who she was sent to live with. The aunt, according to Marissa's letter, was a stern woman who strictly made sure that her niece did not dare to go out after school. After lessons, Marissa was given 2 hours for homework, then expected to complete household chores. Her chores included cleaning, cooking dinner, and gardening. Her aunt checked her phone daily, regularly invaded her privacy, and reported to Marissa's mother about the progress of her re-education. In the second letter, Marissa wrote that she found a way to evade her aunt's constant surveillance. She would go to the basement to fetch vegetables and preserves, as her aunt disliked the damp. There she had a few minutes of privacy to write her letters. She wrote this one over the course of a week. If Timothy wanted to respond, he could send his reply to the address of Marissa's school friend, who would pass it along. The third letter from Marissa was brief. She wrote that she understood Timothy's reluctance to respond and promised not to impose on him any further. The same day, he got off the train and bought a bus ticket, eager to see Marissa and explain himself. He headed to the address of her school friend with a plan in mind. "I'll try to get Marissa out and take her away with me right away." A tall girl with a black braid opened the door. "Are you Timothy?" she asked, grinning in response to his puzzled look. "Marissa drew your portrait. She's good at drawing. It looks like you." "Can you give me her address or phone number?" Timothy asked. The girl shook her head, frowning. "Her aunt married her off to some guy. They've left for the countryside. I haven't heard from her since." "What village? What do you mean? Married her off? Couldn't she refuse?" Timothy exclaimed in disbelief. "She couldn't," sighed her friend. "Her aunt locked her in the attic and beat her every day. She was given a choice, Get married or rot there." "Tell me their address," Timothy demanded. "I don't know it. They left at night without telling anyone and wouldn't let me see her." He went back the same evening and bought a bottle of some disgusting liquor at the bus station. Luckily, he, the autopilot instinct of his body, saved him from potential trouble, and Timothy managed to reach his dormitory. He awoke in the middle of the night in his bed, plagued by a terrible headache and thirst. A bottle of mineral water sat on the bedside table, and a basin was placed on the floor beside the bed. His neighbours, evidently experienced, had cared about him. God bless them, he thought, drinking the mineral water greedily before falling back into a deep sleep until morning, dreamless. Life went on. Timothy's father eventually left his mother, but did not live long. He passed away 10 years later. He went to sleep and didn't wake up. An easy death, the doctors and friends at the wake commented, seemingly envious of the peaceful ending devoid of humiliation, fear or pain. Timothy funded the funeral and lingered at the grave, clutching a heavy bouquet of white roses. The stems pricked his hands, and their leaves were unpleasantly damp. "Thanks, Dad. I love you and all is well," he whispered, gently laying the flowers on the grave. He and his father may not have been as close as he would have liked, but they were not distant either. His father had come to his aid during his most challenging moment. He understood his son's pain, helped him leave, and gave him a letter to his beloved. It wasn't his father's fault that Timothy didn't arrive in time. Timothy once saw Marissa, quite unexpectedly, 10 years after their last meeting. He remembered that October day as a world of rain and wind. He had sought refuge in a nearby cafe and had just settled at a table when he felt someone's gaze on him. "Marissa?" he whispered. She smiled at him, her presence brightening the gloomy day. "Marissa, are you here alone?" "Alone," she whispered with a nice smile, raising her glass of juice. "Cheers." They chinked his coffee cup and her glass. "How are you, Timothy?" "I moved here after high school, graduated from college, and now I'm working," he said. Marissa sipped her juice. "I was sorry I couldn't say goodbye to you. I was afraid you'd be upset." "Well, of course I was upset, but your mother told me that it wasn't your fault." "I wrote to you several times, but when you didn't respond, I thought—" "My mother intercepted your letters," Timothy said. "My father found them and gave them to me. I came looking for you." "Yes, she told me." "It doesn't matter, Timothy. I'm just so glad we met. I thought I'd never see you again." "And what about your life?" he smiled. "I suppose you've got kids already?" Marissa sighed and shook her head. "Actually, no. I often go to the city, to the clinic. They say I'm fine. I guess—" she sighed again. "It's just not time yet." "And your husband, are you living well?" Timothy asked. Marissa smiled nonchalantly. "All sorts out in our life." They talked until the evening and realized it only when it was already dark outside the windows. "You've probably been waited for at home by now, aren't you?" Marissa shrugged. "When I come here, I always tell my husband that I'm staying at the clinic overnight." "But, in fact?" Marissa laughed, seeing the confusion on his face. "I don't have a lover. It's just so nice to go shopping, buy yourself something, or go to the movies, or sit in a cafe. It's my own personal sip of freedom. I've never really been free. First my parents had me on a tight leash, then my aunt, and then my husband." She spoke candidly, not dodging answers or trying to be sly. She's always been like that. "You haven't changed a bit," Timothy said, looking at her fondly. Yes, there were wrinkles under her eyes, and her lips were not as vibrant as they once were, but Timothy didn't pay any attention to these minor details. The spark of true magic lay in her infectious laughter and the innocent expression in her eyes. This was his Marissa, his first love, who had completely turned his life around. "Do you want to go somewhere else? Maybe to the movies?" Timothy asked. Marissa traced her finger over the frosty glass, filled generously with ice by the bartender. How can she drink such a cold juice in this weather? He wondered. "I don't want to go to the movies,"
she said finally. I want to come to you. The next morning, Timothy woke up to find that Marissa had already left. The scent of her hair still lingered on the pillow, and a note lay on the table with just one word. Thank you. There was no other message, no phone number, nothing. No one at the cafe remembered Marissa. It became clear to Timothy that she had been there by chance, and all he could do was cherish their fleeting encounter and continue with his life. Mum could never become happy. Even though Timothy now had enough money to support her, she was never content. Just like during his childhood, she always found reasons to criticize and insult him. One day he realized he would never be good enough for his mother, and it was futile to try pleasing her. From that point onwards, Timothy lived a quiet life, no longer seeking his mother's love and approval. And he was living quite well, I must say, until the previous year, when a neighbour informed him that his mother had slipped on her way back from the store. It turned out that she had fractured her femoral neck, resulting in a cast and a bleak prognosis. Don't worry, Timothy, the head doctor reassured him when he arrived to the hospital. Yes, the injury is severe, but your mother is quite healthy for her age. I believe she'll recover soon. The mother greeted him with a strained smile. I'm a cripple now, she whispered. I can never stand again. You will be able, Timothy promised. As soon as you're discharged, we'll go to my place. You'll get physical therapy, massages. We'll hire a nurse to help you walk. You'll be walking before you know it. His mother smiled, her face as pale as a sheet of paper. In due time, Timothy took his mother to his place. However, as usual, nothing seemed to satisfy her. She showed no interest in physical therapy, made no attempt to stand, and the first two nurses left within a week due to her demanding nature. Only the current nurse, Valerie, could handle her. Timothy paid her generously and did not hesitate to agree to a high payment as long as she stayed. And now he couldn't believe that his mother had voluntarily become disabled just to be taken care of. He didn't finish his thought. The phone screen displayed the nurse's number. Before he could answer, Valerie's urgent shout rang out. Timothy, come back immediately. I don't know what to do. Your mum saw Avery and... I'm coming, shouted Timothy, without listening to the end. As he burst into the apartment, the nurse emerged, carrying a frightened Avery in her arms. From his mother's room came anguished screams. You filthy brat! No children in my house! I don't want to see her! Throw her out! It's all right. Girls, Timothy whispered, moving towards his mother's room. I'll handle this. Inside, he saw his mother wreaking havoc and smashing anything within reach. Vases, candy bowls, cups. What a scene. Throw her out, she shrieked. Out! Out! Seeing her son, she froze momentarily before collapsing to the floor. Timothy, help me, she pleaded, reaching out to him. Help me up. I've been here for a while, Mum, he responded quietly, and I saw you moving around. You're imagining things. I couldn't reach Valerie, so I tried to get to the bookshelf and then... You managed to reach it, Timothy said, looking at the books scattered on the floor. Go back to bed. I'll ask Valerie to give you a sedative. Son! He left the room. The nurse and Avery were still standing in the hallway. Give me the girl, he said, and give Mum something to calm her down. She seems to have gotten too excited. Well, you, young lady, he said, turning to Avery, it wouldn't help to get some sleep. We'll warm some milk and honey now, and when you fall asleep, I'll start looking for your mummy and daddy. I don't want to go home, the girl begged. Daddy yells at Mum, beats her, and then beats me, saying that he wanted a boy, and I was born a girl. No one needs me. Hush, hush, he whispered to the sobbing girl. Let's calm down. I'll think about what we can do. Do you love your mum? I do. Well, there you go. Your mum needs to know where you are. She's worried. Do you remember her phone number? Her phone number is on the tag of her overalls, said Avery. Here, take a look. Great, that solves something.
Timothy smiled. Let's go drink some milk, and I'll call your mum right now. A woman answered the phone. From her hoarse and nervous voice, filled with sobs, it was impossible to determine her age. Are you Avery's mum? He asked. Yes, I am. What's wrong with her? My name is Timothy. Avery is at my house right now. She's fine. I found her in the woods. Please come and pick up your daughter. Is she okay? The woman choked on her tears. As gently as possible, Timothy reassured. Calm down. Everything is fine. I'll let Avery speak to you now. Avery smiled happily. Mummy, she shouted, I was lost, but Timothy found me. He gave me pancakes, and he has many rooms and a good nanny. Mummy, will you come get me? I'll be there soon, very soon, the mother screamed. Wait for me, daughter. Mummy's coming, announced the little girl. So we'll wait for her, said Timothy. You haven't changed your mind about sleeping yet? And Mummy? She'll wake you up. In the meantime, let's go. He took the girl into the guest room, laid her on the sofa, and wrapped her with a fluffy plaid. You can imagine that you are lying in a bear's den, Timothy said, and next to the bear is sniffling in his sleep, and you are basking against him, and you are warm. Warm! It's great, isn't it? Is the bear kind? Asked the sleepy girl. Kind, wise and brave, said Timothy. He will make sure you don't get cold, and he won't let anyone hurt you. He will treat you with honey, the most fragrant and delicious. And also... But the little girl was already asleep. Timothy smoothed her dishevelled hair. Sleep, my little friend, he whispered, and left the room. The nurse was waiting for him in the kitchen. I've injected a sedative. Your mother is sleeping, she reported. Good, Timothy said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Now tell me, what has happened here? Valerie looked at him confused. Timothy, honestly, I went to make a bath for the girl. Then your mother called me and asked, What's that childish voice? I told her it was your friend's daughter. And then I couldn't believe my eyes. I didn't know. And then what happened? Valerie sighed, rubbing her palm across her forehead, and continued. Your mother said, Bring her in, I want to see her. I called Avery. Your mother started questioning her about her identity and her mother's name. Suddenly she jumped up and lunged at the girl. I barely managed to shield Avery. Your mother started screaming. You must have heard her. She ran around the room in that state. But you know that before she couldn't even take a step because she always claimed it hurt to step on her feet. Yes, I know. I quickly picked up Avery and ran out. I locked her to your study and immediately called you. I believe you, Valerie, the man said. Have some tea and calm down. We both had a hard day, and I'll wait for Avery's mum. He didn't have long to wait. The doorbell rang just as he finished his sentence. I'll get it, said Timothy, standing up. Then there was a long silence, so long that it made Valerie worry. She had no idea that a haggard and trembling Marissa was standing at the door. Timothy, Marissa stammered, is that you? He silently took her hand and pulled her close. Marissa started sobbing. I thought... Shh, it's okay, Marissa. Avery is asleep. Do you want to see her now? Let's go. Marissa knelt in front of her sleeping daughter, her hands fumbling as they touched the little girl's hair and adjusted the plaid. Let her sleep a bit, Timothy whispered. She's had an exhausting day. Let's go talk. He led her to his study and settled her into a chair. Marissa's hands were shaking. We'll get through this, he promised, procuring a bottle and glass from the bar. I don't... Just take it, he insisted, making her sip. Take a sip and then again. Marissa obediently sipped, squinted her eyes but swallowed. That's it, good job. Now tell me everything from the start. And she began. When I got married, Glenn said he needed me to bear children. He wanted at least 5 boys. He didn't love me, but he believed that since I was young, everything would be fine. But it didn't turn out fine, Timothy whispered. Yes, he was so angry. He beat me, claiming I was disgracing him. He pointed out that others had 3 children and were expecting a 4th, whereas I couldn't give birth to 1. His mother took me to some woman who prepared herbal concoctions for me to drink, as unpleasant as they were. We eventually went to the clinic for a checkup. They told me there was nothing wrong and suggested my husband get checked instead. But I didn't tell him. He would have beaten me again for even suspecting it. I told him I would go for treatment, and I finally got pregnant. I thought Glenn would be ecstatic, but all he said was, "Even a useless sheep gives some wool." Of course, he expected a son, but we had a daughter instead. He was furious, constantly shouting about not wanting to feed an unnecessary family, claiming a girl was only a loss unlike a son. But I didn't pay attention to his words. Why should I? I had a lovely daughter. Lately, he'd been acting strange, smirking at our daughter. I even thought he might have gotten attached to her. Today, he said he was taking her for a walk in the woods, but he came back alone. He said she got lost and he couldn't find her. "Wait a minute," Timothy interrupted. "Could Avery be my daughter? Things didn't work out with your husband, and then her age is matching. Marissa, tell me the truth. Is Avery my daughter?" She responded with a long look, then gave a slight nod. "I wanted it very much. When I left you that morning I was hopeful, and it turned out to be for a good reason," said Marissa. Timothy rubbed his chin and replied, "Well, you realize I won't let my daughter go to that monster, and neither will you. You can stay here, right here, today, now. We'll formalize your divorce. Do you want to go back to him?" Marissa grinned bitterly. Who in their right mind would want to go back to him? "Well, that's settled. Then you're both staying. First, we'll—" "Throw her out!" came from behind the door. Then the door swung open, and Marissa's mother entered the room. She walked confidently past Marissa and sat in a neighbouring chair. "This one," the woman pointed contemptuously at the guest, "isn't part of my plans. I didn't give birth to you, Timothy, for you to get married and forget about your mother. You're supposed to be my help in my old age, not—" "So, you're walking well, right?" interrupted Timothy. "You have finally recovered. Then why have you been pretending to be weak all these months?" "Throw her out," came from behind the door. Then the door swung open, and his mother entered the room. She walked confidently past Marissa and sat in a neighbouring chair. "Mum, this is my home," said Timothy, "and I make decisions here, and I've already decided. My future wife and my daughter will live here. If you don't like it, you're free to leave, especially since you don't seem to need any more help from me or the medical team." His mother sighed convulsively, her eyes brimming with tears. "This is how you treat me. I always knew you were like your father. I didn't just want to believe it, but I was told. I was warned one day." Her voice trembled. "You will remember me when your children do the same to you. And you," she glared at Marissa with a hateful look. "I knew you were mean, spoiled, and insolent from the start. I advised your mother and aunt to marry you off to Glenn." "What?" Marissa gasped. "You? But how?" "I knew everything that was happening to you. I watched you through your mother. I found Glenn and hoped that you'd be far away from my son. But you found a way to get back. Remember, Timothy, if you marry this viper, you're no longer my son. I don't want to see you or your children. I will never accept her. Now, I'm leaving. I'm going back to my apartment because my own son has kicked me out of his house." With these words, the woman stood up and, with determined steps, headed for the exit. "Secondary benefits," Timothy muttered. "What?" Marissa asked. "Nothing important. I'm sorry I got you caught in this scandal. I didn't realize it myself until today." The front door slammed loudly as the mother left, and confused Valerie knocked on the door. "Timothy, your mother just left. She got dressed and left, and I—" "It's all right, Valerie," the the man said. "She doesn't need your services anymore. But if you need a job, maybe you could stay with us. You could be a nanny for my daughter, Avery." Valerie nodded, smiled, and, most importantly, didn't ask a single question. "Mummy, you're here!" A dishevelled little girl from her nap ran into the office. Marissa jumped up and held out her arms. "Avery!" "Yes, Avery, your mum is here now," Timothy replied with a smile. "And you know, we have talked and decided that it's better for us to live together. Mum doesn't mind, does she?" Marissa answered him with such a radiant smile that there could be no doubt. She was only in favour. "You know," she whispered in Timothy's ear, "I always hoped that one day you would find me and this nightmare would end." He put his arms around her and lightly kissed her temple. "Now all the nightmares are behind us. Only good things await our family." "What about your mum?" Marissa asked. "Is she going to be—" "As for Mum, I'll give her money to cover everything, but then, I don't know. It's too painful for me to discuss right now. I'm simply not ready for this." "Rachel," the neighbour said reproachfully, "you can say whatever you want, but you still have a good son." "If he were good, he'd be concerned about his mother's old age, not some woman," retorted Rachel. Her voice was so full of conviction that it momentarily frightened the neighbour. "Rachel," she said gently, "have you ever loved anyone in your life? Not in your way, but genuinely, like people usually do." "Are you implying I never loved my son? I carried him for 9 months. I was constantly sick, swelled up like a hippopotamus, and had a 24-hour labour. Then I never got any sleep, just feeding him constantly." "But did he ever refuse you anything? He's still giving you money." "I don't need his money." "Oh, come on. You claim you don't need his money, but you take them. There's something wrong with what you're saying." Rachel sighed, her voice laced with tears. "What choice do I have? I'm a poor, ill pensioner. I'm forced to accept this charity, even though I don't want to." "Well, well," the neighbour smirked. "You're not being truthful again, Rachel. You're upset because your son isn't under your thumb anymore. You wanted him to remain attached to your apron strings forever, but he's married, has a child, and moved on." "He abandoned me for her. He cast aside his own mother to be with her," Rachel cried out. "I can't even bear to utter her name." "You're twisting the truth. You left of your own accord and spent a year causing trouble to him before that. You wanted Timothy to abandon everything and chase after you, didn't you?" "I am his mother," answered Rachel with dignity. "It's my right." The neighbour shook her head. "You're a piece of work, Rachel. I'll leave you to it. There is nothing I can speak with you any more." Rachel gazed out the window. It was a blooming July. The hot summer sun had cooled, giving way to a warm evening. Children's laughter echoed from the playground. Though she hadn't admitted it to her neighbour, Rachel had once boarded a train to Timothy's city. She hesitated to ring the doorbell, sitting on a bench in the shade. Suddenly a hopeful thought crossed her mind. Perhaps Timothy has already sent that woman and her child away. Maybe she could return to his apartment to live together again. He was upset with her, but it wasn't a big deal. She could explain that she had spoken out of turn in the heat of the moment. She would find the right words. Suddenly she noticed her son. He carried Avery on his shoulders and held Marissa's hand. They were chatting and laughing. The worst part was that the vile woman, that serpent, was pregnant again. She shamelessly caressed her large belly, looking incredibly pleased with herself. The sight made Rachel want to leap up and make a scandal. "How dare she steal my only son, take my place, impose her brood, and get pregnant again? She did all this deliberately, the wretch." Rachel seethed. "She planned all this to make sure Timothy wouldn't leave her. She's a wicked woman." Filled with indignation and a sense of helpless despair, she returned home, collapsed onto her bed, and burst into tears, pounding her fists into her pillow. It was clear that her son was happy with his family,
while she had been cast aside. The neighbour was right. Rachel dreamed of her son, devoting his life to her and her happiness. But would he be happy at that? Once it seemed to her that otherwise, and could not be. Maybe she was wrong, and maybe it was not so bad that he created his own family and raised children. After all, he did continue their lineage. Rachel looked longingly at the yard where neighbourhood grandmothers sat on a bench, leisurely conversing, while their grandchildren played in the sandpit or the playground. I could do that too, Rachel sighed bitterly. For the first time, her heart filled with sadness for her unfamiliar grandchildren. The next morning, the woman went to the candy store, where she bought a huge cake and then took the train. When she found herself at the door of Timothy's apartment, she suddenly felt that her courage was leaving her. What if they don't open the door for me, or even if they do, but give me harsh words and throw me out like a stray dog? I won't survive that, Rachel fretted. However, did she buy that cake and travel 2 hours on the train in vain? She had to decide, so she rang the bell. Timothy opened the door. He appeared so surprised to see his mother, as if he didn't recognize her initially. Hello, Timothy, the woman said softly. I've come to tell you, I was wrong. Wrong about many things. I thought you should only belong to me. That's why I gave birth to you. I was only taking care of myself, and I didn't realize how much you've done for me. And now, all of a sudden, you've realized everything, haven't you? He asked. Well, I had time to think about everything and recognize what loneliness is. I want to be a good mother, not selfish, and a good grandmother, if you'll let me. He glanced at the box of cake. Did you bring this for us? For you. I thought maybe we could have tea together. Timothy, his wife called out to him, are we having guests? Marissa approached her husband and froze in place, looking at Rachel. She held a plump baby asleep in her arms. Marissa, Rachel said, I've come to visit, but first I want to apologize for everything I've done to your life. Marissa looked questioningly at her husband. He put his hand on her waist. Well, you've apologized. And perhaps you really have rethought things. In that case, welcome. Marissa sliced the cake and placed it on plates. The kitchen was warm and smelled of fragrant tea. Rachel sat at the table, holding Avery on her lap, and suddenly felt a strange feeling of happiness and calmness. Her family was with her, and it was wonderful. Just to love them.